Good morning to you. It's 7 o'clock on today's show. Rare earth minerals in return for US support. Donald Trump says the US has agreed a major deal with Ukraine.
Sir Keir Starmer flies to Washington later today after announcing the biggest rise in defence spending since the Cold War.
And playing cricket with one of the world's most repressive regimes. We'll discuss today's match between England and Afghanistan.
It's Wednesday, the 26th of February. Your headlines. Donald Trump says the American taxpayer is going to get their money back plus after agreeing a deal with Ukraine. The government planned to slash the foreign aid budget to fund the military. We'll speak to the Defence Secretary in the next few minutes. More than 20 cases investigated in a second post office IT scandal.
I would give everything to have her back tomorrow.
And for her to see her name being called.
Yeah, just to see that everyone knows that she didn't do what they said she did.
The government's climate advisors say we'll have to eat less meat, scrap gas boilers and tax frequent flyers to reach net zero. And there was extraordinary scenes as Chris Eubank Jr. slapped an egg into Conor Benn's face at the end of a fiery press conference. A very good morning to you. The United States has agreed a major deal for minerals with Ukraine. Donald Trump say the agreement will mean that the US taxpayer gets their money back for hundreds of millions in military aid given to Ukraine. Sir Keir Starmer flies to Washington today for his own meeting with Donald Trump, and we'll have more on that with Mari in just a moment. But first, here's what he had to say about the deal with Ukraine.
So what we're doing is now we're saying, look, we want to be secured. We want to get that money back. We're helping a country through a very, very big problem, a problem like very few people have had. Shouldn't have had this problem because it shouldn't have happened, but it did happen, so we have to straighten it out. But the American taxpayer now is going to get their money back plus.
Mari, Keir Starmer's obviously off to Washington, and I mean, looking backwards at yesterday, first of all, in terms of maybe we'll come to what the conversation might be like, he's going with an offering.
Exactly. He's got something already in his pocket when he lands in Washington later today, and that makes a huge difference. I think realistically it's symbolic that the UK is taking Donald Trump's words and comments seriously, that the UK is wanting and willing to lead when it comes to defence spending and upping that across Europe and leading the charge for Europe. And so to an extent, you know, it's symbolic on so many levels. Now, the other thing that is quite interesting is the idea that they've come up with to cut the foreign aid budget in order to pay for this defence spending. Again, there's a lot of synergy there between the fact that Donald Trump has done almost the same thing. He cut the aid budget in the US. And so, again, it's another indication of Keir Starmer going to Washington and showing Donald Trump that they have these things in common and that they are aligned in their thinking when it comes to kind of global strategic decisions.
It's so interesting. I mean, boosting defence spending certainly will appeal to Donald Trump.
Absolutely.
Cutting the aid budget shouldn't really make any difference at all, but it might well appeal to him, as you say. I guess the key point, though, in cutting the aid budget is it was the only way, really, that they could announce this in advance of this trip, because otherwise they'd have to wait for the spring statement.
Yeah, surely. Although there may have been a way you could have done something, but it would have, Parliament would have had a nightmare about it. So I think this is really, like you say, the only way of doing something significant without it being part of a fiscal event, as you say, for the timing of this trip. And just on the kind of timing of that trip for tomorrow. So the PM is actually flying out today, but he's going to be having lunch tomorrow with Donald Trump in that meeting. David Lammy's also going to be in that meeting as well. So it's a bit of a kind of team effort, as it were. And then they're going to hold a press conference after they've had that meeting, which will be 2 p.m. US time, 7 p.m. UK time. And I think that will be a really interesting moment, like we watched the one with Macron and Trump, to see how much of the rhetoric matches up between the two leaders and where the gaps are and where the lack of alignment might be.
I think it's going to be fascinating, and presumably before the formal press conference, we'll get the usual tete-a-tete in the Oval Office. They'll have the meeting and then they'll bring in the rest of the press pack. Although I was looking at that point that they're going to be meeting over lunch. It might hint at a way that they're trying to get round the sort of bring in the press for that part of it. But as long as there is at least one live press conference.
Some level of scrutiny is what we need.
We will be all glued to that. Mara, great stuff. Thanks so much for that. Well, as we've been discussing, the government has slashed the international aid budget and announced the biggest rise in defence spending since the Cold War. Our deputy political editor, Sam Coates, has this analysis of the changes announced yesterday.
Big announcements, big spending, big figures. That's what the Prime Minister wants you to know. But do the numbers stack up? This £59.8 billion is the Ministry of Defence budget in the coming year. It's the lion's share of military spending, which makes up 2.3% of our GDP. And this £13.4 billion on top is how much more Keir Starmer says it'll cost to increase defence spending to the government's new target of 2.5% of GDP. Now, that's an enormous amount of public spending. Some's designed to impress Donald Trump, but would require big, big cuts elsewhere to achieve. Now, Keir Starmer's getting tough, and he did today offer up one big cut to pay for it, slashing the aid budget. Now, that aid budget is due to be this much, £13.7 billion, which represents 0.5% of our national income. And Keir Starmer said today that this would drop to 0.3% of our national income. But here's the thing, that saves just short of £6 billion. And that's a big, big gap. So what does the government say about this shortfall? Well, quietly, the government admit to some creative accounting. This £7.9 billion figure is the gap between what we pay now for defence today and what it would have risen to anyway in 2027, because defence spending is pegged to GDP at 2.3% of it. Now, I wouldn't ordinarily call that section an increase in spending, but Keir Starmer can do that and therefore get a much more impressive sounding figure to brandish in front of Donald Trump. Now, Labour promised to raise international development in the manifesto, not cut it. So here's why they've done it. Exclusive YouGov polling, which shows the public backed this move by a margin of 2 to 1, more than 2 to 1, 62 to 25. Labour voters like it much less. Look at that. But amongst voters who backed reform last year, it's an absolute belter. And voters really don't want to see cuts to other services to fund this increase. More money, that's clear today, but so much of this is actually a mystery. Keir Starmer said that some intelligence and security spending would count towards the target from 2027, and the government won't answer whether future payments to the Chagos Islands might be part of it too. And if we're being honest, once you start to prod, lots of bits of defence spending turn out to be pretty mysterious. Government departments refuse to give an overall total for defence spending, want to include things like intelligence. I asked for a complete list of what elements can count towards the 2.5 NATO target, and the government wouldn't tell me. Keir Starmer just doesn't want inconvenient facts distracting from the big picture. He just wants Donald Trump to understand we're paying a lot more for defence. He hopes it'll do the trick of the White House this week.
More analysis with Sam and Anne on their podcast. You can scan the QR code on your screen now if you haven't done so already. And Sam will join us a little later in the morning. And also, more importantly, Sam, we'll be speaking to the Defence Secretary himself, John Healey. That's due in the next 5 minutes or so stick with us. We just want to show you some live pictures in the meantime in Rishon LeZion in central Israel, where Israelis have lined the streets for a public funeral procession for Shiri Bibas and her 2 young boys, Kfir and Ariel. The 3 were taken hostage by Hamas and died while in captivity. Their bodies were handed back to Israel last week. Well, later on this morning, there'll be a funeral service with eulogies expected from the Bibas family. Now, we've had an update on the Pope's health. Sky's Lisa Holland has it for us, as always, from Vatican City. Lisa, what can you tell us?
Yes, good morning. Just one line, as we have come to expect with these morning updates, that the Pope had a peaceful night and is resting. I think throughout the course of today, what we really will be waiting for news on is the results of the CT scan, which Pope Francis underwent at the Gemelli Hospital yesterday. Now, we were told, Sky News was told, that we would be given the results of that CT scan today. Why it is of interest, I think, is because it should give doctors a real sense as to whether or not Pope Pope Francis is winning his battle against pneumonia in both lungs. That scan should give them a clear view of the extent of the infection and whether or not the treatment programme that he has been undergoing is working. Meanwhile, the suggestion from the Vatican that the Pope will attempt, even in his fragile state, to have another visitor today. We're told to expect a visit from the Vicar General of the Diocese of Rome. If that goes ahead, it will only be the third person to visit Pope Francis since he went into hospital on February the 14th. Previously, he had a visit from the Secretary of State of the Vatican, and he was also visited midweek last week by the Italian Prime Minister. Meanwhile, of course, the Vatican is saying that his mild kidney problem persists and he remains on oxygen.
Lisa, as always, thanks so much. Now to a second post office IT scandal. Sky News has learned that more than 20 cases are being investigated as possible miscarriages of justice over a system used by sub-postmasters in the 90s. Adele Robinson has spoken to the family of a woman convicted for stealing from the post office, whose case is now being reinvestigated.
I think deep down we were ashamed.
A secret kept for 26 years.
I get very emotional about it because of what she went through.
One Pat Owen took to her grave.
Because of the post office, dying at 62 years old, heart failure, broken heart.
Her family speaking for the first time about Pat's 1998 conviction for stealing from the post office.
And then when she came home, she was a different woman. So we felt, we didn't talk about it. We didn't talk about it amongst ourselves, as a family. We didn't talk about it with the extended family. Our extended family don't know.
She was so confident, she knew she didn't do nothing wrong. And when the guilty verdict came out, she actually fell to her knees in the dock, crying her eyes out, shaking.
Sky News has learned the number of so-called capture convictions, like Pat's, now being investigated for miscarriages of justice, have more than doubled. All part of a post office scandal predating the infamous Horizon, which saw hundreds wrongfully convicted.
So this is all her paperwork.
But Pat's case is significant and could help turn the tide on convictions like hers.
That's the court documents, so everything's in there as well.
Like other sub-postmasters in the 90s, Pat used capture software we now know was likely to cause accounting errors. And in these documents, something new, evidence about the computer never heard before.
The problem on the computer is a faulty motherboard. This would have produced calculation errors and may have been responsible for discrepancies.
It's a description of malfunctions in the software from a computer expert who never turned up to Pat's court case in 1998.
The computer was sitting there on the week of the court case and was never used.
So I heard, now I can't remember who from, that he done work for the post office. If he turned up to be a witness in court for us, he wouldn't get any more work from the post office.
Despite best efforts, the expert's never been tracked down and the post office declined to comment. But victims' lawyer Neil Hudgell says any new evidence like this could possibly help other capture cases.
It's a real case of what if is Patricia Owen's case. You know, as their family, if you sat in their shoes and thinking about, well, if that expert had been able to give evidence, what could the outcome have been? How could life have been the last 30 years? So I say it's something that we've got a bit of a focus on particularly because, again, whilst it's relevant there, it may also be relevant in other cases.
These victims are the oldest in the post office scandal and it could be months or years before convictions are overturned.
I would give everything to have her back tomorrow.
And for her to see her name being called.
Yeah. Just to see that everyone knows that she didn't do what they said she did.
Speedy justice for this family, more important than ever.
Are you worried that this could take years?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll probably be dead. But I hope I'm not. I hope I'm still here to see her name cleared, you know?
Yeah, that's what we want.
Yeah.
Adele Robinson, Sky News.
Well, it's now time for all of the day's other news, and Leah's got that for us. Leah.
Thank you, Wilfred. We will start with Gatwick because the Transport Secretary, Heidi Alexander, says she believes in increasing airport capacity. This is ahead of a deadline on the decision to expand Gatwick Airport's second runway. The airport, which is in West Sussex, plans to bring its emergency standby runway into regular use, which would allow an extra 100,000 flights a year by 2030. 4 men have been arrested after attempting to fly a drone filled with drugs and other illegal items into a prison. Police were called after the drone was spotted in the sky close to Manchester Prison. Officers found prisoners had been burning holes into windows to receive packages, often containing drugs, weapons and even takeaway meals. And a sinkhole has swallowed a car in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Pictures show one vehicle inside the cavity, you can see there, with another perched on the edge. 30 properties were left without water after the road gave way. This was just yesterday afternoon. Luckily, nobody was injured. And now, extraordinary scenes. This is between Chris Eubank Jr. slapping an egg into Conor Benn's face. This was at the end of that fiery press conference between the pair ahead of their fight on April the 26th.
Do you know what I love about this? I mean, obviously there's a lot of drama in these press conferences.
For sure.
To try and build up, and often one wonders whether some or all of it is staged. But if we watch it again from the beginning, Eddie Hearn, who's obviously the world-famous promoter for all of this, he recoils and quickly gets his smart suit out of the shot. So I don't think he knew this was happening. And he probably would have been in on it as the promoter.
True.
So the egg was, I think, at least a surprise to most involved, even if the rest of it's a little bit of theatre and drama.
Can you imagine what the actual fight will be like? Hopefully no eggs.
Well, awesome eggs. I mean, yeah, it's a new tactic, yeah. But anyway, good.
Wowzer.
Good drama before the fight.
Oh, absolutely. Tom Clark is here because we're talking about the UK and whether it should reduce emissions. We're hearing from one report that we need to do it by 87%. That's over the next 15 years. And
yeah, I don't think we're going to see quite the level of drama over this.
But just remind us what this report is.
So this is significant, actually. So we get lots of reports on what we need to do about climate change. The government gets lots of advice. This one, I think, is one of the most consequential we've seen. And you could argue one of the most consequential for the UK economy, given where we stand right now, and the political fortunes of Keir Starmer's government, because they've very much nailed the net zero clean energy thing to their political mast. And this is the advice to the government on how it needs, what trajectory it needs to be on to get to that net zero emissions by 2050. Dealing with the period in 2038 to 2042, which is crucial because it's when net zero runs straight into people's homes, really. So far, most of the 50% cut we've made in emissions has been from cleaning up electricity generation, getting rid of coal, switching gas out for offshore wind. But to get the rest of the way, that other 50%, that is going to be in people's homes. We've seen headlines about giving up eating meat and stuff like that, but really there's just two things that consumers could do that would make 70% the contribution, their personal contribution to climate change, getting a heat pump and an EV. But they're two of the hardest, and we went to find out a little bit more about those challenges. Having the heat sucked out of your home, watched by a thermal imaging camera.
I don't think you'd appreciate how much of a draft there is from the... Wow.
Reveals the drafts and cold spots that, multiplied across tens of millions of properties, represent the next front line in tackling climate change. Maria's house in Bristol, like pretty much all the rest in Britain, will need a bit of work before they can ditch their gas boiler for a greener, more efficient heat pump and see it save money in the long run.
I think in terms of, financing it, yeah, there'd need to be some kind of support because it's, I don't have, spare capital to put into just sort of, funding this outright.
The difference between the top and the bottom of the chart on here is...
It's why the latest report from the Committee on Climate Change is its most consequential yet. Few of us noticed the 50% cut in emissions achieved so far, made by ditching coal for wind and solar power. But cutting the remaining 50% falls largely in and around our homes. By the late 2030s, heat is important. Warming our homes with zero-carbon electricity is the single most important step to getting to net zero. But the electrifying pace will have to increase both in our homes and beyond. Roughly 1% of all UK homes have a heat pump fitted. By 2040, that figure needs to rise to 52%. Electric cars on the road must go from 2.8% now to 80% by 2040. And industry needs to decarbonise more too. Electricity currently meeting 26% of demand, that should grow to 61%. And all that demand will require 6 times more electricity from offshore wind. But, says the climate watchdog, it will have to get cheaper quickly. Consumers simply won't switch until it makes life better.
It's not asking you to be colder, not to drive, not to take your holiday. It's saying we expect business and government to work to make these better, modern technologies available to you. And also that means that we help the planet.
Their new advice shows how consumers and the wider economy will benefit from the rapid shift away from fossil fuels mandated by law. But it's a cash-strapped government that must work out how to afford the fixes needed to deliver it.
So it's the takeaway from all of this that what we've achieved so far, which I think is fair to say is quite impressive, is the easy work.
Yes, I think that's it. It's unfair to say it was the low-hanging fruit, but it wasn't easy. We had to put a levy on everybody's bills to help pay for that transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. But I think it's fair to say most of us didn't really notice it happening. The big spikes in our energy bills that we've experienced over the years, and most recently when the war in Ukraine began, was due to the volatile price of natural gas, of fossil fuels. So the government's got a really strong argument here. Get us off fossil fuels. It will make our bills cheaper. This analysis suggests if we did all these things and reduced emissions like that, to put in our heat pumps and our electric cars, we'd be saving about £700 a year on our energy bills and about £750 a year on our driving costs, because electrification is more efficient inherently, less waste, less heat generated. And also electricity that's generated in the UK is cheaper and more stable. The big issue is we have to spend a lot of money up front, invest a lot to make that transition happen. And we don't have huge amounts of money sloshing around at the moment. And consumers don't have money to put into it themselves. You know, we're all living in a cost of living crisis, recovering from those energy bills. It's a big, big challenge. And that's where the government has to really fudge this through and expect the private sector, I think, to help carry some of this burden.
Tom, great stuff as always. Thanks so much for that. Well, we're going to take a quick break here on Sky News Breakfast. When we come back, we'll be talking to the Defence Secretary, John Healey.
Once almost lost, these denizens of the deep are back.
The problem for these whales is global warming. Water temperatures are rising.
We're worried that the animals are actually starting to starve.
Deadly and outdated. What do you think should happen to the nets?
I would like to see them go.
I'm Nicole Johnston, Sky's Asia correspondent, based here in Beijing.
A towering monument to the China dream and its demise.
From one end of this country to the other, China is littered with real estate that's falling apart.
China is facing a tsunami of the elderly.
We have to work as long as health allows, otherwise, no money.
China is under pressure to pay for the pensions of 500 million retirees. I've reported on a wide range of stories from around the world.
Mass protests forced the president to flee.
The sight of the president's private swimming pool only reinforces to Sri Lankans the great divide here between rich and poor.
Aid groups say Gaza is now the world's most dangerous place to be a child.
The Israeli army has raided towns and villages all over the West Bank.
These tunnels run all over Gaza. The Gaza Strip is ridden with them. A referendum designed to unite the country has only deepened its divide.
Sydney's floodplains underwater again.
This is the third or fourth time in the 18 months that their homes have gone under.
Sky News, the full story first. that may seem like a gimmicky toy, but it is part of the global race between the United States and China for new technology. This elite engineering, designed to humour and to help us.
Weeknights on Sky News.
This is your chance. Tell people. Welcome to the Politics Hub.
Our police force has apologised.
If you want to find out about Grimsby, you come to the docks.
I'm live in Jerusalem.
Are you not concerned that that could lead to all-out war?
Hello there, good evening. There are fears of an upsurge in violence. What's at stake here?
You are watching the press preview, a first look at the front pages as they arrive.
I saw police being forceful, pushing young men and women to the ground as they made almost 100 arrests. Will the cold affect your voters?
Well, we have a lot of tremendous support.
Free wherever you get your news.
The people here know that worse storms may well be on their way.
I'm Martha Kellner and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles.
Welcome back. More now on the government's plans to slash the UK's aid budget and boost defence spending to 2.5% of GDP. Well, I'm delighted to say that joining us now is the Defence Secretary, John Healey, from Wellington Barracks. Good morning to you, Defence Secretary. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good morning.
Is it fair to say that you wouldn't be boosting the defence spending as you are if not for Donald Trump?
No, it's not. I was with Keir Starmer back in April last year in Barrow when we made the commitment to increase defence spending to 2.5% of what this country produces. That's a level we've not spent in this country for 15 years. We made that commitment to the public in the election manifesto, and yesterday he announced that we're delivering that early, 3 years before anyone thought we would. And we're doing that because the world has changed. We need to increase defence spending, we need to strengthen our armed forces, and we need to make our defence industry the driver of economic growth in this country, and we will.
And Donald Trump has played no part in the changing world that you're responding to.
Donald Trump has certainly been very direct in his challenge. He's played a part, of course he has. He's reinforced the importance and the imperative of doing that. He's challenged Europe to step up on European security and within NATO. He's challenged the UK to help lead that, and we will. And so what Keir Starmer was saying is that we'll boost defence spending. The UK will help lead European nations within NATO to do more of the heavy lifting. And we must make sure that we can equip our frontline forces with the kit that makes them more ready to fight, better able to deter Russia and other adversaries, because we're in a world now of increasing threats, and we need a new era for defence to keep Britain safe and stronger.
Obviously, the Prime Minister's off to see the President in the next 24 hours. Based on your call with Pete Hegseth, the Defence Secretary, do you think Donald Trump will be welcoming the Prime Minister, given this announcement?
I do, and President Trump himself overnight has indicated that, but the new Defence Secretary, Pete Hegseth, said publicly, look, Keir Starmer's step was a strong step from an enduring partner, and the US-UK relationship, they are our closest security ally. We're strong partners on trade, on economic growth, on technology. And Keir Starmer will be saying to President Trump, look, we have a special depth to our relationship that goes back decades, not just on security and defence, but that's at its heart. And Keir Starmer will say we want to see that relationship go from strength to strength.
Clearly, the main part of the announcement is 2.5% of GDP by 2027. Is that ironclad at this point? And how strong is the commitment to get it to 3%, and by what year?
Yes, that commitment to 2.5% by 2027 is ironclad. The important thing is that Keir Starmer said exactly how we will fund that, so people can have confidence in that. Our industry can be confident that we have a long-term plan to boost them as part of strengthening our own security. As far as 3% goes, we've said in the new Parliament we will have to hit 3%. It's a signal of a long-term rising defence spending. It's a signal to other European countries that they also must do more. And it's a signal to the US and to our adversaries in particular that Europe will do more of the heavy lifting on our own security. We'll step up further on Ukraine because it's important that Ukraine stays strong in order to get a secure, durable peace. And we will also do more across the board on defence industry and defence spending.
On Ukraine, are you encouraged to see President Trump say that he's reached a deal with President Zelensky on mineral rights in Ukraine, or are you a little concerned? Is there a sense that perhaps Zelensky's being bounced into something that he doesn't welcome?
Well, I think the details are still emerging, and in the end it's a matter for Ukraine and for the US. Anything that binds the US more closely into the future of Ukraine, that reinforces the President's commitment to deliver a durable peace in which Russia can be deterred for the long term, is a good step. We've still got a long way to go. Talks have started, but negotiations haven't. And in the meantime, my job and the job of other defence ministers is not to jeopardise that peace by forgetting the war. And so my conversations with the Defence Minister, Minister Umerov, yesterday were about how we do more to keep Ukraine strong, what we do to help them supply the military equipment they need in order to keep fighting, and to reaffirm our commitment that as the UK, we're proud of our UK leadership, we're proud of our UK unity on Ukraine over these 3 years, and we'll step that up still further.
Clearly boosting defence spending in the short term helps our defence. I don't think there's any argument about that. Reducing aid spending in the long term, are there negative defence implications of that, potentially?
Look, Labour's a party in government with a long, proud history of help for the very poorest countries and boosting international aid. So this was a really difficult decision taken in circumstances that demand that we respond to this once-in-a-generation moment. But this is a time when hard power, not soft power, is needed to try and prevent and deter future conflicts. And that's why the Prime Minister said yesterday, we have taken that hard decision. He's taken it with the full backing of the British Cabinet. And now my job as Defence Secretary is to make sure that we make the best use of this, better value for money for the taxpayer and for our troops, that we can see this boosting British jobs, British business, British technology in the future, as well as reinforcing Britain so that we're more secure at home, we're stronger abroad.
I wanted to bring your attention to one line of your manifesto, Defence Secretary. I could have picked a number of comments from Keir Starmer, from David Lammy, but I think the manifesto probably sums it up best. You said that you are committed to restoring development spending at the level of 0.7% of gross national income as soon as circumstances allow. I guess things have changed. You've outlined how they have changed and that this is a generational security moment and you have to put the nation's security first. But is it fair to acknowledge that security is requiring you to breach the manifesto, therefore?
What we said in our manifesto remains, and Keir Starmer said yesterday, it remains our long-term aim. It's our desire to see an increase in UK development aid. You've got to remember, we'll still, in 2027, we'll still be spending $9 billion on development aid, but national security must come first. The world has changed. We face an era of increasing threats. We must respond to that, and we must respond to that including by increasing defence spending as the Prime Minister laid out before Parliament yesterday.
Which I totally get, but clearly that manifesto pledge will not be delivered in this Parliament. In that essence, it's a breach of the manifesto, albeit for legitimate national security grounds.
Difficult decisions. Difficult decisions demanded by the challenges we face, the increasing unpredictability and danger in the world, the more aggression that we see from adversaries. And it's important to remember Russian aggression isn't confined to Ukraine. And if Putin prevails in Ukraine, he won't stop at Ukraine. which is why that I've always argued that Ukraine is the UK's first line of defence. It's why this year we will be spending more in military aid than ever before, and we will step up further to make sure that we keep Ukraine strong. Because in the end, if we want a lasting, durable peace, as President Trump and Zelensky have both said, peace comes through strength.
And just finally, to wrap things up, Defence Secretary, yesterday the Prime Minister described this as a generational security challenge. He said it was a significant moment that we face in terms of a threat, albeit he didn't go as far to say that we are currently in danger. I wonder what your assessment is if we don't do this, if we don't then get to 3% of GDP, would we be in danger then?
Well, we face risks all the time. We face Russian aggression all the time and other adversaries that will do us ill in cyberspace, undersea, in our airspace, even on our streets with risks of sabotage, and we saw assassination attempts 7 years ago. So what Keir Starmer was saying is that national security comes first. This government will always do what is the first duty of any government, which is to keep the country safe and protect our citizens. And he was quite clearly saying to the public, because the world faces and Britain faces these increasing threats, this requires us to take difficult decisions. We're a government that will do that, and we will always put the safety of this country, the strength of this country first.
Defence Secretary, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We're going to get a response from the Conservatives. Tom Tugendhat will be joining us next hour. We'll get his response at about 8:15. Meantime, let's get the response of an expert on this topic, also to get his take ahead of Sir Keir Starmer's trip to Washington to see Donald Trump. Sir Nigel Sheinwald's able to join us. He's the former ambassador to the US. He's also former ambassador to Europe and also chief foreign policy and defence advisor to Tony Blair. A few better qualified people to join us on this. Sir Nigel, how significant, good morning to you, how significant is it that we're boosting defence spending? A small amount, I guess, but more than previously and fairly quickly, 2.5% by 2027.
I think it's significant. I think it's necessary for this week. I heard what John Healey said about this being a policy and announcement long in the making, but I think this is very much to do with the Trump world that we're in, the timing of it, the urgency of it. I accept those arguments, and I think that we're right to do what we're doing, with some reluctance, evidently, on the aid side of this, because I don't think aid and development is simply soft power. I think they're connected. The money and the resources and the skills are involved in conflict prevention, conflict resolution, humanitarian aid. These are all at the sharp end of international relations. So the sooner we're able, over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, to correct this decline in our development spending, the better.
In terms of the extent this will change the tone of the meeting between Starmer and Trump, do you think it is a game changer?
I don't think by itself it's a game changer. I think it will help Keir Starmer. I think he's right tactically to have made that call, as he was being advised to do by a number of people within government. So I think that's right. But I don't think by itself it solves our problem, which is that we now have a president who has torn up the playbook. Not just the playbook, he's torn up the rules of the game for the alliance, which have been there for nearly 8 decades. So, and I don't think Keir Starmer can be reasonably expected to fundamentally change Donald Trump's mind, but he needs to get him to move to a certain position beyond where President Macron got him on Monday. The bar was set, I think, on Monday, where at least President Macron was able to announce some of the truths about the current situation, who was the aggressor, who's paying for what. But I didn't think we heard anything from Donald Trump's person to suggest that he'd heard a great deal or was moving even tactically in response to Western European concerns. So I quite see why Keir Starmer has taken the view that he mustn't criticize the president in public before this. We know how touchy Trump can be, but in private, he has to be direct. He has to make his points. He has to make clear the extent of our interests, which are caught up in this. Try and move Trump away from the position that this is a negotiation which will continue to be handled in this chaotic way by America alone. He needs to draw in not only Ukraine, but also the European allies to give some steadiness to the negotiating posture we have with Russia. I don't think it will change Trump's fundamental predilection for dealing with the Putins, the President Xis of this world. He seems to have a taste for dealing kindly with autocrats. I think that's based on his personal political experiences in America. He doesn't want to be messed around by institutions in his own country and is quite prepared to give free rein to others who have that freedom of maneuver in their own. That's uncomfortable for us. That's not our worldview. I don't think Keir Starmer is very likely to change it. But I do think that President Trump, if he wants to get a durable peace in Ukraine, has to take our concerns into much greater account. And that's the task for tomorrow.
You mentioned Macron there, of course, Nigel. Let's touch on Friedrich Merz. Is he now de facto leader of Europe? And what are the implications of that? Not just on defence spending and relations with the US, but on the possibility of a rationalisation of UK dealings with the EU?
Well, I think he's the leader of Europe's by far largest and most important country, and he's going to be in power for the next 4 years. So he's a little bit like Keir Starmer. He's someone that President Trump can't avoid because he's going to be around for the length of Trump's own term. So I think that's important. I don't think that our view is necessarily the view that he enunciated on coming immediately after the election earlier this week. I don't think that we have to assume its complete independence of Europe. That for the UK is always going to be second best to trying to maintain as much as we can of the relationship with the US. At the same time, I would say, as putting our foot on the pedal of doing this reset with Europe. It seems to me that's the bit which is missing at the moment, and that's where Keir Starmer has to plough ahead in the months ahead with this Defence and Security Pact and other changes that he's talked about. Merz is known for sometimes speaking out a little rashly in public. I think he was right on the analysis, maybe wrong to go quite as far as he did on Monday, because I think you need to put pressure on Trump, and you won't do that by simply saying that we're going to do it all by ourselves. And that's not realistic in the short term, because these defence commitments, these foreign policy policies aren't a light switch element of policy. They take time, and we couldn't imagine being able to transfer even a lot of the weight of European defence to the EU and UK and other European nations, with America just stopping in its tracks. So this has to be a more managed process than it appears to be from the rhetoric of the last couple of weeks.
Sir Nigel, always a pleasure. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Wolf. Sir
Nigel Sheinwald there. Well, we'll have much more on that topic, of course, throughout the day, building up to the meetings tomorrow. And well worth tuning in, if you haven't done already, to the Trump 100 podcast. Our US correspondents Martha Kellner, James Matthews and Mark Stone are building up to exactly what might be discussed between Trump and Starmer, also discussing Donald Trump's announcement that he's found a deal with President Zelensky of Ukraine on mineral rights in Ukraine.
Volodymyr Zelensky is coming to town to meet President Trump here at the White House on Friday.
It means, presumably, Mark, that this minerals deal, this long-awaited deal, is close to being signed, yeah?
Yeah, and it also can only mean that our week is going to get even busier, because Thursday, of course, is Keir Starmer's day here at the White House. And I guess that kind of, in a way, reframes some of Keir Starmer's visit, because I think, as you say, James, the only reason that Zelensky will be coming here on Friday is because the minerals deal that we've been talking about over the course of the past few days is close to being done.
We're wondering about the awkwardness of a meeting between Keir Starmer and Donald Trump, but surely the real awkward moment is going to come when Zelensky, a man who Donald Trump called a dictator just a matter of days ago, is in the same room as him.
Yeah, the dictator meets the Donald. Actually, I think, Martha, I think the name-calling will be the least of Zelensky's worries. What will cloud the atmosphere, I think, is what Ukraine gets from this deal that he's signing up for. What are the hard security guarantees? We don't know. What's in it financially for Ukraine in the long term? We don't know that either. And there is also the small matter of Vladimir Putin in the wings.
This minerals deal seems like it's going to be at the heart of that meeting. There's reporting from Axios News in the United States. They say that President Zelensky managed to negotiate a final draft of this deal that removed a US demand to have rights to $500 billion in future revenue from the land, but also that there'll be no specific security guarantees included within it.
Well, do scan the QR code on the screen right now to subscribe and listen to the Trump 100 podcast if you haven't done so already. Now, the country's leading medical minds are warning a lack of space in hospitals is having a direct impact on the safety of patients. Research by the Royal College of Physicians found almost 4 in 5 NHS doctors treated patients in corridors or waiting rooms in the past month. Well, joining me now is Matthew Thompson to break down, I guess, the significance of this and some of the data that we're getting, Matthew.
Yeah, look, I mean, it's shocking, but I don't think at this point it's entirely surprising, and that tells its own story. But essentially what the Royal College of Physicians have done is they've surveyed just under 1,000 doctors. About 45% of those that responded said that they had treated in the last month patients in corridors. A smaller percentage, about 27%, said they treated patients in other temporary areas, in beds and chairs, in patient bays, for example. And then a small but not insignificant percentage, about 5%, said they treated patients in places that just not even designed for patients to be in, like toilets and things like that, for example. And 60%, this is the really striking thing, I think, 60% of doctors said that they felt that all of that had compromised patient safety. And that is the really alarming thing. Dr. John Dean is the clinical vice president of the Royal College of Physicians, and here's what he told us.
This is distressing for doctors, nurses, all other health professionals trying to deliver the best care they can, but in an environment that's not enable them to do that. But what's important about this is that we have clarity about it. We've got action. We know how big the problem is. We're calling on the NHS to publish data on this and publish it consistently on a month basis, because this isn't just a winter problem. This is an all year round problem, and we have to work together to eliminate this unsafe care.
Actually, last year, NHS England said that it was going to start at least collecting that data of people being treated in corridors and the like from this January. But it's not been published yet. And as of yet, we don't quite know if and when there is going to be a publish of the data, which is why he's calling for it there.
Matthew, great stuff, as always. Thanks so much. So to come here on The Breakfast Show, we'll be discussing the Afghan female demand that International Cricket Council takes a stand against the Taliban as the men's team play England today, while the women remain banned. We'll speak to Amnesty International about that next.
Our app gives you the very best of Sky News wherever you are. Breaking news, videos and analysis.
Evidence of the crisis.
Podcasts, watching us live.
Live here from Washington.
Wherever you get your podcast.
All in one place. And all at just the touch of a screen. The Sky News app. Get the full story first.
I'm James Matthews and I'm Sky's US correspondent, based here in Washington, D.C. I've covered some of the biggest stories in the world.
I'm Deborah Haynes, Sky's security and defence editor. I've covered Russia's full-scale war since it began, witnessing the terror and the trauma.
I'm Stephen Murphy, and I'm Sky's Ireland correspondent based here in Dublin. Sky News, get the full story first.
I'm Martha Kellner, and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles.
Getting the chance to tell people's stories, it's a privilege. I'm Adam Parsons, Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Brussels.
I'm Dan Whitehead, Sky News' West of England and Wales correspondent. Sky News, get the full story first, free, wherever you get your news.
The town famous for a fake grooming scandal.
I did not leave the house for about 3 years.
Had a secret that until recently wasn't known.
Barrow got branded to be a lying town. It's not. Grooming was happening here.
There were other liars in this town with other secrets.
She is naming men who go on to be convicted of offences against other women and girls.
The judge made it very clear that she could see no justifiable reason why Sakulas wasn't here facing British justice.
I promised I would get him justice.
Sky News, get the full story first.
It's legal to let go.
Set the speed and take the hands off. I'm Lisa Dowd and I'm Sky's Midlands correspondent.
Mandatory evacuation, you must leave!
For many people, Harvey is far from over.
People here believe the water will be this deep for weeks.
I'm Greg Milam and I'm Sky's Chief North of England correspondent.
Are you trying to run me over, Sir Philip?
No, go away.
Look like it, sir. Will you respond to those who made accusations, Sir Philip?
Can you go away?
Sky News, the full story first.
England play Afghanistan in the crucial Champions Trophy match today, but the match has been controversial because of the Taliban's treatment of women. The Afghanistan women's cricket team fled the country in 2021 after the Taliban regained power, and most of them sought refuge in Australia.
Well, Sky's Jackie Baltrell spoke to Afghanistan women's cricketer Firuza Amiri, who says simply boycotting the men's team is not the answer.
I think banned cricket for men's team won't impact that really for women's. But I always say at the end of the day, all these decisions come to ICC. So it's been always unfair decision from ICC for us. We sent letter to ICC. They never respond to us. They always keep making excuses. And they always say having a Afghanistan women's team is complicated. It's not that complicated. It's simple as we want to have a team.
Well, head of campaigns at Amnesty International, Felix Jeakins joins us now. Calls then, Felix, for a boycott from everyone from Jeremy Corbyn to Nigel Farage, even Piers Morgan. If a boycott was to happen, I doubt the Taliban would care very much, but I suppose it gives you the platform to talk to us today about the issues.
Yeah, and ultimately, as we just saw in the clip, a boycott might not be the solution to the situation here. What we want to see as Amnesty International and as certainly the Afghan women's team and hopefully the men's team and everybody involved in cricket and with an interest in the country, want to see women cricketers playing cricket in Afghanistan again, both inside the country and the exiled team. So this is an opportunity really to talk about the issues in the country and for the ICC in particular, who have the greatest responsibility here, to put pressure on the Afghan authorities to enable women to continue to play the game that they love in Afghanistan.
What's your view, Felix, towards both the Afghan men's players and the England men's players? Is any of this sort of their fault, as it were? No, and in the big world of sport and politics, players are often the ones that get dragged into some of these conversations. And, you know, to give them their credit, the ECB have been quite strong on this issue. They have talked about gender apartheid taking place in Afghanistan. And, you know, sports people have enough on their plate to deal with when they've got to just go and compete in these games. That said, we would still want them to be fully aware of the situation in Afghanistan, the situation for the women's team, the situation for women in general in the country. And if they do feel able to speak out about it. But ultimately, the decision here to allow Afghanistan to continue to compete is the ICC's, and it's they who should be putting pressure on the Afghan authorities to reinstate the women's game. They're in breach of their own rules by allowing Afghanistan to field a competitive men's team without having a women's programme.
And Felix, we heard from Firuza Miri there, and part of her argument was that actually, let's make something happen, let's take action. And she was saying how actually the team could be given refugee status and represent Afghanistan potentially in that way. But essentially, they feel sidelined. They feel like nobody's talking to them. And that then extends to how women feel in Afghanistan currently, which is true for many women across the country, I suppose.
Yeah, and I mean, Amnesty and others have well documented the fact that Afghanistan as a country of nearly 50 million women has essentially the worst record of human rights for its treatment of women out of any country in the world. So I can't speak for those women, but we know that the repression that's widespread across the country, denial of access to work, education, health, chance to socialize, singing, talking outside the home, looking out of windows. I mean, all of these things are in one way or another penalized by the Taliban. So it's really clear and well documented that the treatment of women there is very, very severe and harsh. On the point about whether or not the women should be given refugee status, well, ultimately that wouldn't be what we'd want to see. We'd want to see them just being able to compete in the sport that they love for the country that they're from, rather than having to seek exile outside. So really, we'd want to see the Taliban reinstating a women's program and running a competitive national women's team.
And Felix, just quickly, we're nearly out of time. I mean, you've outlined how terrible the situation is for women in Afghanistan. Is it getting progressively worse? Is it getting marginally better or not?
No, I mean, it seems to be getting worse. So when the Taliban initially took power, they promised kind of progressive changes and that women would be, playing a role in society, but that is just not what we've seen. Amnesty in 2023 published a report called The Taliban's War on Women, and we decided there that the crime of gender persecution, gender apartheid is being committed by the regime. And in every area of public life and in many areas of private life, the situation for women in Afghanistan is getting worse.
Felix, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Felix Jeakins, Head of Campaigns at Amnesty International. We're going to take a quick break here. That does it for the first hour of Breakfast. We'll be back after this short break with all of the day's top stories ahead of Prime Minister's trip to Washington.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story.
I'm ready. Are you?
Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
Good morning to you. It's 8 o'clock. On today's show, rare earth minerals in return for US support. Donald Trump says the US has agreed a major deal with Ukraine.
Sir Keir Starmer flies to Washington later today after announcing the biggest rise in defence spending since the Cold War.
And playing cricket with one of the world's most repressive regimes. We'll discuss today's match between England and Afghanistan.
It's Wednesday, the 26th of February. Your headlines. Donald Trump says the American taxpayer is going to get their money back, plus after agreeing a deal with Ukraine.
Ukraine's president is also preparing for his own visit to the White House, where he'll be hoping to lock in Donald Trump's support against Russia.
The government plans to slash the foreign aid budget to fund the military. We'll speak to former Security Minister Tom Tugendhat in the next few minutes. More than 20 cases investigated in a second post office IT scandal.
I would give everything to have her back tomorrow.
And for her to see her name being called.
Yeah. Just to see that everyone knows that she didn't do what they said she did.
And there were extraordinary scenes as Chris Eubank Jr. slapped an egg into Conor Benn's face at the end of a fiery press conference. Very good morning to you. The United States has agreed a major deal for minerals with Ukraine. Donald Trump says the agreement will mean that the US taxpayer gets their money back for hundreds of millions in aid sent to Ukraine in recent years. Sir Keir Starmer flies to Washington today for his own meeting with Donald Trump, and we'll have more on that in just a moment with Mari. Meanwhile, Deborah is in Kiev for us, but let's listen to what Donald Trump said first of all.
So what we're doing is now we're saying, look, we want to be secured. We want to get that money back. We're helping a country through a very, very big problem, a problem like very few people have had. Shouldn't have had this problem because it shouldn't have happened, but it did happen. So we have to straighten it out. But the American taxpayer now is going to get their money back plus.
Let's go live to Ukraine and our defence and security editor, Deborah Haynes, standing by as ever. Deborah, good morning to you. Have Ukraine said that they've agreed this deal as well?
Yes, so a Ukrainian government source told us last night that this, what was described as a framework agreement, has been agreed. It's not been signed yet. That's expected to happen probably before this meeting on Friday between Volodymyr Zelensky and Donald Trump, where you can expect those two leaders as well to sign the deal. In terms of the actual particulars, though, for example, there's been a long time of negotiations over the last couple of weeks with Ukraine, very frustrated about what it viewed as overly onerous demands from the United States for its mineral wealth, up to $500 billion worth of natural resources, the value of natural resources. There's going to be like an investment fund that is set up that will invest in extracting minerals such as titanium, lithium. There's obviously oil and gas here as well, and the profits from that fund going to the US taxpayer as well as to Ukraine. But that contentious figure of $500 billion, we're told, is no longer in the agreement, also not in the agreement, and has never been in the agreement thus far, is a explicit commitment from the United States to provide security guarantees to Ukraine in the wake of this ceasefire deal that Donald Trump says he wants to broker between Ukraine and Russia. This is something that Ukraine has repeatedly says is absolutely fundamental for it to be confident that Russia won't just stop fighting, rearm and attack again, but would actually be genuinely deterred. And that's where the British Prime Minister has stepped up into this extraordinary, really, new leadership role in Europe, along with France's president. They've been rallying European allies to try to compile an international force, which they will be talking about, I'm sure, with Donald Trump, but it needs this US backstop. So there's still a lot of questions.
Many questions. Deborah, thanks so much for that. And Mari's here as well, of course, ahead of Keir Starmer's trip to Washington. And so interesting, of course, the timing of the announcement yesterday and hearing Nigel Sheinwald's perspective that it will make a difference ahead of that meeting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, ahead of that trip to Washington, actually, the PM's got to do PMQs today at midday. So he's got to face his own backbenchers, some of which, like, for instance, Syria Champion, have been really, really critical of this ability and decision to cut aid in order to fund defence spending. So he's going to have potentially a bit of a rough time at the dispatch box first. And then, as you say, he'll be going to Washington. He'll be having a lunch with Donald Trump. David Lammy will also be there. So, you know, sending all the big guns in, as it were. And then a press conference tomorrow about 7 p.m. UK time. And when you were speaking to John Healey just earlier this morning on The Breakfast Show, he was arguing that the 2.5% idea, the 2.5% pledge is ironclad. And he was explaining what kind of a signal that would send to the US and to Donald Trump.
That commitment to 2.5% by 2027 is ironclad. The important thing is that Keir Starmer said exactly how we will fund that, so people can have confidence in that. Our industry can be confident that we have a long-term plan to boost them as part of strengthening our own security. As far as 3% goes, we've said in the new Parliament we will have to hit 3%. It's a signal of a long-term rising defence spending. It's a signal to other European countries that they also must do more. And it's a signal to the US and to our adversaries in particular that Europe will do more of the heavy lifting on our own security.
Reducing aid spending in the long term, are there negative defence implications of that, potentially?
Look, Labour's a party in government with a long, proud history of help for the very poorest countries and boosting international aid. So this was a really difficult decision taken in circumstances that demand that we respond to this once-in-a-generation moment. But this is a time when hard power, not soft power, is needed to try and prevent and deter future conflicts. And that's why the Prime Minister said yesterday, we have taken that hard decision. He's taken it with the full backing of the British Cabinet. And now my job as Defence Secretary is to make sure that we make the best use of this.
So John Healey there trying to outline the thinking and the justification behind this decision. You can see a series of op-eds in different newspapers. He was in The Sun this morning, Keir Starmer in the Daily Mail, Rachel Reeves in the Telegraph, David Lammy in the Guardian. They are all mounting this fight back because they know this is not what they would consider to be a kind of Labour move, as it were, to cut the aid budget. Keir Starmer was very, very clear about how he found this decision very difficult and it was not something he ever wanted to take. And in that clip there, you also saw John Healey explaining around the fact that it was a once-in-a-generation moment and a discussion on the aid budget. That would suggest to me they have no more plans to cut it again, but they wouldn't actually give any concrete promises on the fact that potentially, is it possible to raise that aid budget again?
It's interesting on the politics of all this, which perhaps isn't what the most important issue is, but you say it's not necessarily seen as a Labour move to cut aid funding. It's probably outweighs, if you did have some polling on this, to change what the perception of Labour is as it relates to defence spending. This is probably something that most people kind of celebrate, even if it comes at a cost.
Absolutely. So our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, has been doing some great reporting on this, and he has looked at the polling, and it is very, very popular. People like boosting defence spending, and people don't really like foreign aid. And therefore, the argument is actually this is really, really popular. It's not so popular with Labour voters, interestingly, but it's very popular with people who are voting reform or wanting to vote reform, and we know that Labour are bleeding voters to reform, so that might be a way to bring some of those voters back.
Really very interesting, as always. Maury, thank you. Well, in the next few minutes, we'll be speaking to the Conservatives about all of this. The former Security Minister, Tom Tugendhat, will be joining us any moment now. In the meantime, we just want to bring you some live pictures of Israel, Rishon LeZion in central Israel, where Israelis have lined the streets for a public funeral for Shiri Bibas and her two young boys, Kfir and Ariel. The three were taken hostages by Hamas and died while in captivity. Their bodies were handed back to Israel last week. Well, later on this morning, there'll be a funeral service with eulogies expected from members of the Bibas family. These are live pictures. Obviously, we can't quite see how the streets are lined as we did last hour, currently focusing in on a helicopter above, but more on that throughout the morning here on Sky News. Now to a second post office IT scandal. Sky News has learnt that more than 20 cases are being reinvestigated as possible miscarriages of justice over a system used by sub-postmasters in the 90s. Adele Robinson has spoken to the family of a woman convicted for stealing from the post office, whose case is being reinvestigated.
I think deep down we were ashamed.
A secret kept for 26 years.
I get very emotional about it because of what she went through.
One Pat Owen took to her grave.
Because of the post office, dying at 62 years old, heart failure, broken heart.
Her family speaking for the first time about Pat's 1998 conviction for stealing from the post office.
And then when she came home, she was a different woman. So we felt we didn't talk about it. We didn't talk about it amongst ourselves as a family. We didn't talk about it with the extended family. Our extended family don't know.
She was so confident, she knew she didn't do nothing wrong. And when the guilty verdict came out, she actually fell to her knees in the dock, crying her eyes out, shaking.
Sky News has learned the number of so-called capture convictions, like Pat's, now being investigated for miscarriages of justice, have more than doubled. All part of a post office scandal predating the infamous Horizon, which saw hundreds wrongfully convicted.
So this is all her paperwork.
But Pat's case is significant and could help turn the tide on convictions like hers.
That's the court documents, so everything's in there as well.
Like other sub-postmasters in the 90s, Pat used capture software we now know was likely to cause accounting errors. And in these documents, something new, evidence about the computer never heard before.
The problem on the computer is a faulty motherboard. This would have produced calculation errors and may have been responsible for discrepancies.
It's a description of malfunctions in the software from a computer expert who never turned up to Pat's court case in 1998.
The computer was sitting there on the week of the court case and was never used.
So I heard, now I can't remember who from, that he done work for the post office. If he turned up to be a witness in court for us, he wouldn't get any more work from the post office.
Despite best efforts, the expert's never been tracked down and the post office declined to comment. But victims' lawyer Neil Hudgell says any new evidence like this could possibly help other capture cases.
It's a real case of what if is Patricia Owen's case. You know, as their family, if you sat in their shoes and thinking about, well, if that expert had been able to give evidence, what could the outcome have been? How could life have been the last 30 years? So I say it's something that we've got a bit of a focus on particularly because, again, whilst it's relevant there, it may also be relevant in other cases.
These victims are the oldest in the post office scandal and it could be months or years before convictions are overturned.
I would give everything to have her back tomorrow.
And for her to see her name being called.
Yeah. Just to see that everyone knows that she didn't do what they said she did.
Speedy justice for this family, more important than ever.
Are you worried that this could take years?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll probably be dead. But I hope I'm not. I hope I'm still here to see her name cleared, you know?
Yeah, that's what we want.
Yeah.
Adele Robinson, Sky News.
Time now for all of the day's other top stories. Leah's got those for us.
Thank you so much, Wilfred. The Vatican says Pope Francis spent a peaceful night in hospital and is resting. Crowds gathered in St Peter's Square yesterday to pray for the 88-year-old who remains in a critical condition in hospital with pneumonia in both lungs. We expect results from the Pontiff's CT scan to be released later today. The country's leading medical minds are warning a lack of space in hospitals is directly impacting patient safety. Research conducted by the Royal College of Physicians has found almost 4 in 5 NHS doctors treated patients in corridors or waiting rooms in the past month. Transport Secretary Heidi Alexander says she believes in increasing airport capacity ahead of the deadline on the decision to expand Gatwick Airport's second runway. Well, the airport, which is in West Sussex, plans to bring its emergency standby runway into regular use, which would allow an extra 100,000 flights a year by 2030. And check out these extraordinary scenes. Chris Eubank Jr. slapped an egg into Conor Benn's face at the end of a fiery press conference between the pair. This is ahead of their fight on April the 26th. Wow.
It's an odd thing for a boxer to do, isn't it? Meant to be all tough guy at this point, and you're throwing an egg.
Yeah, and I'm just wondering, does he carry eggs generally in a bag, just in case? Who knows? But the fight on April the 26th, I'm sure, will be fierce.
It will certainly be more, well, I don't know if it will be more fierce. You'd be rather annoyed, wouldn't you, going into it if you had an egg slapped to your face? Anyway,
yes,
there we go.
We're going to talk net
do you know what? I
zero,
wonder
aren't we?
whether the story should be switched around, whether we should have ended on the Gatwick expansion.
It's a good point.
It's relevant.
I was going to get into
because we want to talk about this new report. Just give us some background on it. What's it saying?
So this is, to my mind, I think one of the most consequential bits of advice to government, certainly in terms of climate change, but I think it goes more broadly than that, because the net zero journey that we've set ourselves on, remember, this is something that was passed into law by a consensus of MPs from all parties, commits us to net zero by 2050. That's a big undertaking that's going to affect every aspect of the economy. This latest advice is legally required by government to keep it on track.
Where does it come from?
It comes from the Committee on Climate Change. They were set up under the Climate Change Act, which is the law that gets us to that net zero target. They have to provide independent advice to every consecutive government to say, look, you need to stick on budget, because if you don't do anything in your term, it's putting the burden on the next government to do. So it requires each government to stick to their plan. They have to respond to that advice. This advice deals with the period 2038 to 2042. Now, it's a way off in the future, but it's saying we need to get ourselves on track to that to get there. And it's a big deal because a lot of those recommendations are about cutting carbon, and yet the government's also committed to growth. And we've just seen, the plans for airport expansion, they're at odds, some of their priorities. And some of the things that we've got to do now on that journey are about to get really difficult because they get into people's homes.
And what's the headline, just quickly, before we get to your report? What is the headline of the report?
It's an 87% cut on carbon emissions from 1990 levels by 2040. So that's 37% more than we've already done, because we've cut emissions by about 50% so far. So it's a lot of work to do, but it's the harder stuff, the fiddly stuff in people's homes.
Let's listen at our report. To your report on how hard it's going to be together.
Having the heat sucked out of your home, watched by a thermal imaging camera.
I don't think you'd appreciate how much of a draft there is from there. Wow.
Reveals the drafts and cold spots that, multiplied across tens of millions of properties, represent the next front line in tackling climate change. Maria's house in Bristol, like pretty much all the rest in Britain, will need a bit of work before they can ditch their gas boiler for a greener, more efficient heat pump and see it save money in the long run.
I think in terms of, financing it, there'd need to be some kind of support, because it's, I don't have, spare capital to put into just sort of, funding this outright.
The difference between the top and the bottom of the chart on here is...
It's why the latest report from the Committee on Climate Change is its most consequential yet. Few of us noticed the 50% cut in emissions achieved so far, made by ditching coal for wind and solar power. But cutting the remaining 50% falls largely in and around our homes. By the late 2030s, heat is important. Warming our homes with zero carbon electricity is the single most important step to getting to net zero. But the electrifying pace will have to increase both in our homes and beyond. Roughly 1% of all UK homes have a heat pump fitted. By 2040, that figure needs to rise to 52%. Electric cars on the road must go from 2.8% now to 80% by 2040. And industry needs to decarbonise more too. Electricity currently meeting 26% of demand, that should grow to 61%. And all that demand will require 6 times more electricity from offshore wind. But, says the climate watchdog, it will have to get cheaper quickly. Consumers simply won't switch until it makes life better.
It's not asking you to be colder, not to drive, not to take your holiday. It's saying we expect business and government to work to make these better, modern technologies available to you. And also that means that we help the planet.
Their new advice shows how consumers and the wider economy will benefit from the rapid shift away from fossil fuels mandated by law. But it's a cash-strapped government that must work out how to afford the fixes needed to deliver it.
A debate on that topic in the next hour of the show. But for now, let's get back to the top story of the day. And, of course, Prime Minister Keir Starmer travelling to the US later today to meet with President Trump and announcing a boost in defence spending yesterday. Let's get the Conservatives' response. Tom Tugendhat joins us now. Very good morning to you, Mr Tugendhat. Thanks for joining us. Do you support this move to boost defence spending?
Absolutely. Look, I think the Prime Minister's made the right decision. I welcome it very much. I think this has got to be seen as a step on the direction towards a higher defence spending, and this is the beginning. Now, the reality is he's set out an agenda for about 2.8%. He's claiming 3%. I can't quite do the maths to make that work at the moment, so I can only assume that Rachel Reeves is busy with the calculator in the background, because removing about £5.5 billion from aid this year and doing a bit of clever mathematics behind it, it looks like we can get to 2.8%. So I look forward to hearing how he makes the maths work to 3%.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's funded for the first step and not fully committed to get to 3%. But that's obviously a step further, much faster than the Conservatives had pledged before the election. And does it show us a sign of nimbleness, a sign of understanding the severity of the situation by the Prime Minister?
Well, it certainly shows that he's realised that the world has changed, right? And that's something that a lot of us have been saying to him publicly and privately over the last few days and weeks. And so it's very welcome. I'm not going to use this opportunity to do partisan politics. I'm just going to say I welcome the fact that he's realised that the world has changed. Look, we are looking at a very different world. We're looking at a world where different commitments are now in question and where it's absolutely clear that whether you believe that President Trump is fully committed to European defence or whether he's just challenging us, the answer is still clear, which is we need to rearm. And the real challenge we've got is we have so little defence industry able to operate at the highest level at the moment. Now, that's not a blame of defence industry. That's simply an observation that industry is coin-operated. If you do not put the money in, you don't get the effect out. And I'm afraid for too long, and this is not just in our time of 14 years, but actually over 30 years, we have not invested significantly in UK defence industry. And that's led to the situation we're in now.
Do you think that the aid budget is the right source in the short term to fund this?
Well, he's going to have to find more money than just the aid budget. I mean, I can see why John Healey has made the correct observation that there's a time for soft power and a time for hard power. And now is a time for hard power. You don't need me to tell you that. You can see it in Ukraine, you can see it in Eastern Europe, and countries like Poland that are spending over 4%, or countries like the Baltic states that are spending the high 3%, some even just about 4%, are demonstrating that the closer you are to Russia, the more aware you are of the threat you face. And the reality is, the Russians are not going to be assuaged with, English lessons and softer skills. The reality is Putin is directly threatening our friends, our allies and our interests. And we are lucky to be the United Kingdom that we have a few thousand miles to the east that provide a buffer. And that's what we call NATO. And it is in our interest to defend ourselves, to support them.
Are you worried by this announcement of a mineral deal between the Ukraine and US? Do you think that Zelensky's been sort of bounced into that somewhat?
Look, I wait to see quite what the deal is. I mean, there's been a lot of reporting around it, and yet I've seen absolutely nothing on paper. So I'm sort of questioning as to what exactly it is. It's not unreasonable for US companies to get an advantage in areas where they have relationships. We've done this in the Middle East. We've done this in the Middle East. The United Kingdom has done this in the Middle East with different oil concessions and so on. So this isn't something new. Quite what the deal is, let's wait and see.
In terms of the shape of Europe at the moment, clearly Germany has a new chancellor. The government's not formed yet, but it will be Friedrich Merz. Do you think that there's an opportunity for the UK to work more closely with him, with Germany, albeit he's echoed quite a strong viewpoint as to being independent from the US moving forward?
Well, look, I think Merz was making sort of noises about the change that we're seeing, and those are changes that Kemi Badenoch was speaking about yesterday in a very important speech that she gave at Policy Exchange, and that were reflected in the Prime Minister's decision on defence spending. So I think there's a sort of a consistency of theme, if you like, in European comments on this, all sort of stemming from the speeches that we heard at the Munich Security Conference and the different ways in which the Trump administration has changed the tone of US defence conversations in the last few months. Let's remember, however, that the change of tone may be true, but the change of direction is not. The reality is every US president for the last 20 years or so, maybe even more, has been talking about Europe doing more in its own defence. And so it's only right that finally we might wake up and listen. And for those who are surprised, it really is, the moment to wake up and realise that actually we've got a choice. If we don't like the way that other countries determine their strategic priorities in favour of their own people, then maybe we should be spending enough so that we can determine our strategic priorities on the basis of our own interests.
What would be your advice to Kemi Badenoch today ahead of PMQs? Would it be to purely, simply, loudly support the decision of the Prime Minister to boost defence spending and focus her questions in other areas, or are there?
I'd give my advice to Kemi privately, if that's all right, Wilf. But look, I think she gave a very good speech yesterday. I thought it was an excellent setting out of sort of conservative realism in foreign policy. I thought it was extremely well drafted, and it set out many of the principles that I very strongly agree with. So I think she's absolutely in the right direction. Personally, I would go further and faster on defence spending. I'm slightly concerned that there seems to be some jiggery-pokery in sort of bringing the single intelligence account into the defence budget and calling that an uplift. But, there's a lot of good there. And I think when the Prime Minister does something right, we should support him.
Tom Tugendhat, always a pleasure. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Still to come here on The Breakfast Show, where we'll discuss the details of what it means on that defence boost with somebody joining us from the director of RUSI. We'll be right back.
Once almost lost, these denizens of the deep are back.
The problem for these whales is global warming. Water temperatures are rising.
We're worried that the animals are actually starting to starve.
Deadly and outdated. What do you think should happen to the nets?
I would like to see them go.
I'm Nicole Johnston, Sky's Asia correspondent, based here in Beijing.
A towering monument to the China dream and its demise.
From one end of this country to the other, China is littered with real estate that's falling apart.
China is facing a tsunami of the elderly.
We have to work as long as health allows, otherwise, no money.
China is under pressure to pay for the pensions of 500 million retirees. I've reported on a wide range of stories from around the world.
Mass protests forced the president to flee.
The sight of the president's private swimming pool only reinforces to Sri Lankans the great divide here between rich and poor.
Aid groups say Gaza is now the world's most dangerous place to be a child.
The Israeli army has raided towns and villages all over the West Bank. These tunnels run all over Gaza. The Gaza Strip is ridden with them.
A referendum designed to unite the country has only deepened its divide.
Sydney's floodplains underwater again. This is the third or fourth time in 18 months that their homes have gone under. Sky News, the full story first. It may seem like a gimmicky toy, but it is part of the global race between the United States and China for new technology.
This elite engineering, designed to humour and to help us.
Weeknights on Sky News.
This is your chance. Tell people. Welcome to the Politics Hub.
Our police force has apologised.
If you want to find out about Grimsby, you come to the docks.
I'm live in Jerusalem.
Are you not concerned that that could lead to all-out war?
Hello there, good evening. There are fears of an upsurge in violence. What's at stake here?
You are watching the press preview, a first look at the front pages as they arrive.
I
I saw police being forceful, pushing young men and women to the ground as they made almost 100 arrests. Will the cold affect your voters?
Well, we have a lot of tremendous support.
Free, wherever you get your news.
The people here know that worse storms may well be on their way.
I'm Martha Kellner and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles.
Welcome back to The Breakfast Show. Well, coming up, we'll be talking about the government's plans to raise defence spending and the human impact of taking money from the aid budget. But first, a reminder of all the day's top stories.
Thank you, Wilfred. A Ukrainian government source has told Sky News terms have been agreed between Kyiv and Washington. This is on a crucial minerals deal. The United States has been looking to secure access to Ukraine's rare earth minerals in exchange for continued war support. So Keir Starmer has announced the UK's defence spending will rise to 2.5% of the country's GDP over the next 2 years. Leaders from across Europe are under pressure to raise their defence budget since the Trump administration took office. The UK's climate advisors have warned the country needs to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 87% over the next 15 years to stay on track to be net zero by 2050. They say the biggest factors include switching to electronic vehicles and installing heat pumps in our homes. And a poll of NHS doctors has found almost 4 in 5 have provided care to patients in corridors and waiting rooms in just the last month. The data has sparked a warning from the Royal College of Physicians that a lack of space in hospitals is impacting patient safety. And crowds have gathered to pray for Pope Francis, who remains in a critical but stable condition, having experienced no additional respiratory issues. We expect another update on the Pontiff's health later this morning.
Yeah, great stuff. Thanks so much. Let's get more now on the Prime Minister's announcement yesterday to boost defence spending. The Director of Military Sciences at RUSI, Matthew Savile's here with us. Matthew, great to have you back.
Good morning.
We're talking about potential to boost defence spending, a week or so ago. Were you expecting it this fast? And is 2.5% by 2027 significant?
I think it's slightly faster than people were expecting because, of course, a lot of the quibbling had been, would it be within this Parliament or not? I don't think it's hugely surprising that the announcement has come ahead of the trip to the US by the Prime Minister, because he's presumably hoping to include this in his discussions with Donald Trump. I think the question over the significance of the money is a much more open one. It'll certainly be welcome, but there are a lot of unknowns in the details that people want to dig into.
I mean, clearly in terms of the headline number, it takes a bit of time to get this sort of amount of money free up. But I think it's also fair to say it takes a bit of time to work out how to spend it effectively. So when we do see some criticisms come out being like, oh, it's a welcome drop in the ocean, for example, I saw was a phrase from General Richard Dannett. I mean, surely we can't suddenly go to 5% or even to 3%.
No, there would be an enormous question about the MOD's capacity to basically absorb huge new spending. And so the idea that you could jump to actually spending that money in 12 months, there probably wouldn't be the industrial capacity or the ability to recruit people. For something like this, there are actually some quite urgent priorities within defence. I mentioned things that we don't know. We don't actually know the state of the budget in terms of overspending. It's been 2 years since there's been an equipment plan, and when that was last produced, the estimate from the National Audit Office was that there was a considerable gap between what was going to be spent and what could actually be afforded. And so there might be some immediate priorities in the next couple of years to basically fill in the gaps or prevent cuts. So I think people shouldn't be looking for hugely dramatic announcements on this kind of figure, but there will be some stuff that could be done in the near term.
In terms of the next pledge of 3% by some point in the next Parliament, which is less ironclad, of course, than the 2.5%, is that a game changer for the state of our defences if we get to 3%?
A lot of this is actually subject to long-term predictions about the state of the economy. One of the problems of us being fixated on the percentage of GDP figure is that GDP is obviously a movable feast. There's also a number of other things that aren't core defence budget money that go into the defence spending figure. So that there, if you like, there are two different pots of money to meet the NATO qualification. So the debate that should really be had is what armed forces do we think we need? What does it cost for that? And actually, can we afford that? So, billions more, 3% could add, could increase the defence budget to north of 80 or even 90 billion pounds. But it depends on actually whether we have reformed the defence and can spend that money efficiently.
I mean, based on current GDP predictions, this extra 5 or 6 billion in the next 2 years per annum, is that significant? And if it was 3% of GDP based on current GDP predictions, is that a game changer?
I think the near term is that it helps the MOD try and stabilise where it is at the moment. And there might be some things that they could accelerate. A lot of the spending should probably not be on new aircraft, tanks or jets. It should be on infrastructure, pay and pensions, training, and critically, given the situation, weapons, stockpiles and ammunition. The calculation that most people have made is that at the moment, if the armed forces were involved in a major war, they would expend spares and ammunition within a matter of weeks.
Just finally, in terms of how this has come about, your assessment, is it 90%, 10% down to Donald Trump and his rhetoric?
It sounds like that. I mean, it looks fairly obvious that the timing of the announcement matters, but the debate over defence spending has been running for several years now, particularly after Ukraine, and it seems likely that the direction of travel was towards 2.5% anyway. It was in the terms of conditions given to the Strategic Defence Review team, for example.
Matthew Saville, thanks so much for joining us. Good to see you.
A pleasure.
Well, this, of course, this boost in defence spending is coming at the expense of the aid budget. Let's talk now to Save the Children. The CEO, Muazzam Malik, joins us. How big a blow is it to you to hear that this is being funded by the aid budget?
Well, it's a huge blow. Good morning. Thank you for having me. It's a huge blow for millions of people around the world. I think this is a betrayal, actually, of vulnerable people around the world, but also of the UK's national interest. And I don't think the government is being entirely straightforward with the British people. The focus today is on Russia and building up military spending for tanks, planes, ships. But of course, the UK's national security and our well-being is affected by so much more. Climate change, the risk of pandemics, conflict around the world, people on the move in response to desperate circumstances, shifting of supply chains and economic instability. All these things affect the UK public's well-being and the future of children here in the UK. And the aid partnerships that are funded by the UK government actually lead to a more stable world that creates a better future for people overseas, but also for people here in the UK. And so in that sense, this is a betrayal of our national interest. And I think the question that the government needs to address is, why does defence spending merit 10 times more spending than the aid budget? We need both defence, we need development, and we need diplomacy, but we need a balanced approach.
Can you give us a hard and clear example in terms of a country that at the moment we give a lot of aid to that might now lose it, and I guess particularly from the view of Save the Children, where children are seriously exposed if that funding gets cut? Where are we talking about?
We don't know the details of the government's plans in terms of where the aid cuts are going to fall. But of course, we've already lived through a round of aid cuts by the UK government in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic. And in countries like Pakistan, the UK's development programme, in fact, was reduced by 90%. In countries like Ethiopia, by 75%. In those countries, we were working as the UK government, and I was there in the UK government at the time. We were working on health. We were working on education, we were working on livelihoods, we were working on vaccinations for children. All of those services had to be pulled back. And so that space that was left in terms of economic partnerships, because those countries do need partnerships and international collaboration, that space for partnerships has been taken up by countries like China, the United Arab Emirates, Turkey and others. So we have vacated space for others to fill, but we've also damaged prospects for children, families and communities in desperate needs. And this round of aid cuts that will follow this announcement, £6 billion worth over the coming years, will inevitably damage humanitarian aid, economic aid, it'll have impact on vaccination. We don't know the details, but it will have real-world consequences for real people.
What is your response when you hear people say, the government say indeed yesterday, that national security comes first, it is the single greatest priority, and equally that the economy is not strong at the moment, so we can't afford everything? What's your response to those 2 points?
Well, my response would be that national security does matter. Absolutely, it should come first. But we should be honest that national security isn't just about the threat posed by Russia, but by the whole range of global challenges that I mentioned. And the aid budget helps respond to that range of challenges that I talked about: climate change, pandemics, conflict, and so much else. We've also got to be honest with the British people that currently government spending, 1% of government spending, less than 1% of government spending goes on the foreign aid budget, less than 1%. That compares currently to something like 5% of government spending on defence. With the announcements yesterday, that gap will widen. So this isn't a lot of money, right? We're talking about 1% of government spend. There's a lot of other government spending there that the government could scrutinise in terms of creating space for a balanced approach to development, defence, and indeed to diplomacy.
Moazzam Malik, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. CEO of Save the Children. Let's continue this discussion. Joined now by our deputy editor, political editor Sam Coates. He's in studio with me, and our world presenter Yalda Hakim as well. A very good morning to you both. Sam, I'll come to you first just on this costing and how it's being funded. I guess the aid budget has been hit and used a couple of times in recent years. And is this coming as a wild surprise to everyone that it's being hit and used again?
Well, I was listening to your previous guest from Save the Children, and I think there's a hard truth that people like him have to accept, which is people, the public, the Labour movement has, regrettably from their point of view, fallen slightly out of love with international development as a concept, aid as public spending. One of the things that we've been doing over the last 24 hours is polling some of the decisions about defence spending and international aid and the trade-off. And the public absolutely backs this. Absolutely backs this. And, of course, Reform voters love it more than any other. But look at Labour voters, people who actually supported Keir Starmer's government last year at the general election. Yes, it's slightly closer, but still by a margin of 48 to 38, Labour voters support switching international aid funding from defence spending. And I think there's a bigger political thing here that charities that like aid spending and want more aid spending need to address, which is there is... we've had the high watermark of public support for aid. You saw that in the early 2000s with Gordon Brown and Tony Blair, Gleneagles Summit, corralling the world leaders around the 0.7% target. That went down to 0.5 in the last parliament. It's now heading down to 0.3 because there is a perception that this money is not well used. The department was folded into the Foreign Office. Keir Starmer never reinstituted the Department for International Development as a new thing. There's no Secretary of State for aid. This has been a trend that people involved in the handing out of aid money haven't been able to change. Over a quarter of the aid budget is spent on the asylum system. It's one of the things that accelerated under the last Conservative government. But there are big questions about whether the money that is spent well, and the people involved in spending it clearly aren't doing a good enough job making their case.
So Yalda, clearly it polls favourably, this decision by the government overnight, but it doesn't ease the pressure on those charities and the parts of the government that need the funding, not least because, of course, the elephant in the room, the US is making similar or even bigger cuts to international aid at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. Good morning, Wilf and Sam. And as you say, I mean, much of my reporting in the field has been around the impact of foreign aid directly on the people who need it most. And of course, we are seeing that trend. And we have seen, as Sam said, that trend for a long time. And the United States has welcomed this move by the British government because, of course, they have done something quite similar with USAID. Last night, we did a special program about the situation situation in Sudan, which is now the world's biggest humanitarian crisis. Millions of people have been displaced as a result of the ongoing conflict there, which is now reached it's more than 2.5 years old, that particular conflict with the warring militias and the two warring sides. And these programs directly assist, whether it's food programs or education programs. There will now be children and women and people who will not be able to have further their education. Their food programs will be impacted. Famine is a real thing in a place like Sudan. Famine is a real thing in a place like Afghanistan. Most of the population are below the poverty line. And so these programs shutting down for political reasons to up defense spending, for example, will have a direct human cost and impact. And as Sam said, I mean, he is right. You can see why the public responds in this way, because there is great criticism in terms of how these programs are executed on the ground. There is a belief that there is a lot of waste. I mean, in a place like Afghanistan, a lot of these programs were subcontracted to people working on the ground. And you'd go to certain villages, for example, and they were known as ghost villages because there was promise of reconstruction. There was promises of programs that were developed in those villages in some of the most remote places. And you'd get there and they just wouldn't exist.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's so fascinating, Yada, getting your perspective on this. I mean, whilst we've got you, just wanted to broaden out. You mentioned Afghanistan, though. Last hour, we were talking to Amnesty International about this cricket match taking place today between the men's England cricket team and the Afghanistan men's cricket team. Of course, many people suggesting that should be boycotted because of the situation women face in Afghanistan and the fact that the women's cricket team can't play at the moment. What's your take on that, and what are your sources telling you?
Well, Wilf, it's been 3.5 years now. 31st of August was when the U.S. left Afghanistan and the Taliban took over that country. And since then, it's almost 1,500 days since Afghan girls over the age of 12 have been able to return to school. Teenage girls have effectively been banned from going to school. And then, of course, the Taliban have issued all sorts of edicts that have pushed women out of the public eye. The simple sort of desire of a mother to take her children to a local park has been prevented. Women can no longer go to a local park, for example. They have been banned from going and working in certain sectors. And so life for women in Afghanistan has become incredibly difficult. The Taliban at one point even said, what reason is there for women to leave their homes? If you need to get groceries, get a male relative to do it. If you're a widow, find a man, in your extended family to assist you. There is no need for women to be seen out in public. Just in the last couple of months, the Taliban asked women not to raise their voices or to be heard when they are praying even. So this is how difficult life has become for women in that country under Taliban rule. And we were told by the Taliban before they swept to power that this is Taliban 2.0. This will be very different from the Taliban of the 90s, where they would even put black curtains on women's homes so they couldn't be seen from the outside. But essentially, that is the state of women in Afghanistan, and let alone sport, for example, which is totally banned. Women can't even go to female-only gyms. And so there was a lot of calls for this match to be boycotted, because the belief was that it goes against the ethos of what the ICC believes in, what cricket is fundamentally about, what sport is about. And so there was disappointment that there wasn't a greater call, there wasn't more pressure placed on the Taliban. There were others who were saying, this has got nothing to do with the actual cricket team, the Afghan cricket team. It's a source of happiness and joy in a very grim place right now. But like all things, the feeling was that the Taliban view the Afghan men's cricket team as a source of pride. They celebrate them. They meet with them regularly. And so this was a way to put pressure on the Taliban to change some of their policies that exist in Afghanistan at the moment.
Well, yeah, thanks so much for that. And I know there's going to be more coverage of it later on The World, indeed on the podcast as well, with Richard Engel. For now, Yalda, Sam, thank you both so much for that. We're going to take a quick break here on The Breakfast Show. When we come back, we're going to be talking about a new campaign that's aiming to empower all women and girls to take their place on the football pitch.
Our app gives you the very best of Sky News wherever you are. Breaking news, videos and analysis.
Evidence of the crisis.
Podcasts, watching us live.
Live here from Washington.
Wherever you get your podcast.
All in one place. And all at just the touch of a screen. The Sky News app. Get the full story first.
I'm James Matthews and I'm Sky's U.S correspondent, based here in Washington, D.C. I've covered some of the biggest stories in the world.
I'm Deborah Haynes, Sky Security and Defence Editor. I've covered Russia's full-scale war since it began, witnessing the terror and the trauma.
I'm Stephen Murphy and I'm Sky's Ireland correspondent based here in Dublin. Sky News, get the full story first.
I'm Martha Kellner and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles.
Getting the chance to tell people's stories, it's a privilege. I'm Adam Parsons, Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Brussels.
I'm Dan Whitehead, Sky News' West of England and Wales correspondent. Sky News, get the full story first, free, wherever you get your news.
The town famous for a fake grooming scandal.
I did not leave the house for about 3 years.
Had a secret that until recently wasn't known.
Barrow got branded to be a lying town. It's not. Grooming was happening here.
There were other liars in this town with other secrets.
She is naming men who go on to be convicted of offences against other women and girls.
The judge made it very clear that she could see no justifiable reason why Sakoulas wasn't here facing British justice.
I promised I would get him justice.
Sky News, get the full story first.
It's legal to let go.
Set the speed and take the hands off.
I'm Lisa Dowd and I'm Sky's Midlands correspondent.
Mandatory evacuation, you must leave!
For many people, Harvey is far from over.
People here believe the water will be this deep for weeks.
I'm Greg Milam and I'm Sky's Chief North of England correspondent.
Are you trying to run me over, Sir Philip?
No, go away.
Look like it, sir. Will you respond to those who made accusations, Sir Philip?
Can you go away?
Sky News, the full story first.
Welcome back. The FA have launched a new campaign today called Made for This Game, encouraging more women and girls to take their rightful place on the football pitch. And with that, the Women's Parliamentary Football Club is based in Waterloo, and it kicks off its campaign today. A team member and MP, Claire Young and Jo Tanner, both join us. Jo Tanner, the founder of the Women's Parliamentary Football Club. Great to have you guys with us. Thanks so much for joining us. Claire, tell us a bit about this new leg of this campaign from the FA and what you think of it.
Well, I think it's great. The previous campaign, Let Girls Play, was all about getting more access to football in schools for girls. But it sounded like you were asking permission, and you don't need to ask permission. Girls and women should just be able to play football by right.
Jo, it's Leah here. Great to have you on Sky News Breakfast. Tell us the reaction from the young players that you're directly impacting. What are they saying to you about this?
Well, I think the thing that our sort of whole raison d'etre really was that we wanted to try and play and see if we could get women of all ages, actually. So the interesting thing is that there are players who play for this team who actually were told at school that they couldn't play. They weren't allowed to join in football with the boys, and it was incredibly frustrating. And so part of our our efforts really as a parliamentary team was to make sure that we were open to all, and it was not about asking permission. And I think we found over the years that there has been sort of outreach from youngsters who've probably found it inspiring to see the Lionesses, see even folks like us just running around, some of us, I would speak for myself, not really knowing what we were doing at times, and have improved over the years. And so I think this is all part of that bigger conversation we have to have about football being accessible for everybody. And it is a really important message for young girls not to feel that they've got to ask permission to be able to play at all.
Yeah, you make such a good point, Claire. I guess the messaging really needs to hit primary schools, really. I've got a 4-year-old who loves football, but if there isn't that space for them to play and feel encouraged, it's really difficult, isn't it?
Well, I think absolutely. I mean, when I was at primary school, I couldn't play in competitive matches. That's all changed, and I think the previous campaign made huge strides, and people have had, girls have been inspired by the Lionesses. When I go around my constituency to football clubs and hear about the girls' teams that are playing now, it's absolutely brilliant. So I think great strides have been made. There's still lots to do.
Joe, it's great that there's a parliamentary football club, but I guess it's another reminder that sport can put political differences aside.
Absolutely. We've been going for 8 years, and part of the reason for starting it was I was one of those mums that watched my son play and thought, why have I never really kicked a ball? And it turns out that there were lots of other women that felt the same. And over the years, we've had players from all political parties. All of the mainstream parties have had people playing for us. And we've had people as young as 22 and as old as mid-50s playing. So it's kind of, we couldn't really be more representative in terms of, age, backgrounds, economic groups, parts of the country that people have come from. And it's really about saying on the field, it's about just getting involved, following where that ball is, and just making the most of the opportunity that you've got while you're there.
Well, Joe and Claire, I wish we had more time. I'm afraid we don't. But thank you so much for joining us this morning. We are out of time here on Sky News Breakfast. We're going to take a very quick break. When we come back, we'll have all of the day's top stories ahead of the Prime Minister's trip to Washington.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story.
I'm ready. Are you?
Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
Good morning, it's 9 o'clock on today's show. Rare earth minerals in return for US support. Donald Trump says the US has agreed a major deal with Ukraine.
Sir Keir Starmer flies to Washington later today after announcing the biggest rise in defence spending since the Cold War.
And buying an electric car or replacing the gas boiler, will be debating how we can do our bit to help reach net zero.
It's Wednesday, the 26th of February. Your headlines. Donald Trump says the American taxpayer is going to get their money back, plus after agreeing a deal with Ukraine. The government plans to slash the foreign aid budget to fund the military. More than 20 cases investigated in a second post office IT scandal.
I would give everything to have her back tomorrow.
And for her to see her name being called.
Yeah, just to see that everyone knows that she didn't do what they said she did.
Scenes as Chris Eubank Jr. slapped an egg into Conor Benn's face at the end of a fiery press conference. Plus,
no one said anything to me about the full Monty. Are you in or are you out?
the latest artist to warn that AI could destroy the music industry. We'll speak to the screenwriter best known for The Full Monty and Slumdog Millionaire. A very good morning to you. As you can see, we've got full team coverage of this top story of the day. As the United States has agreed a major deal for minerals with Ukraine, Donald Trump says the agreement will mean the US taxpayer gets their money back and more. Let's have a listen to what he had to say.
So what we're doing is now we're saying, look, we want to be secured. We want to get that money back. We're helping a country through a very, very big problem, a problem like very few people have had. Shouldn't have had this problem because it shouldn't have happened, but it did happen. So we have to straighten it out. But the American taxpayer now is going to get their money back plus.
Of course, this all comes ahead of the Prime Minister's trip to Washington this afternoon. But let's discuss that minerals deal first of all. Ed Conway, come to you on this. I mean, what minerals does Ukraine have? And what are we talking about? What do we think this deal implies?
Well, it's got so Ukraine traditionally has got a lot of coal. It's got some oil and gas, it's got quite a lot of iron ore, but this is all traditional stuff. The stuff that Donald Trump has been talking about quite a lot recently is rare earths and critical minerals. And on that front, I think it's a much bigger question. I mean, there are some mines that might have a bit of rare earths in Ukraine, but frankly, these are old Soviet-era mines. No one's entirely sure if they can actually get anything out of them and actually look at how much of this stuff there is in the country. And there's less in Ukraine than there is, for instance, in America. There's less rare earths in most countries than in many other countries in the world. So I think there's a big kind of geological question about, how much of an abundance is there of that sexy, exciting new types of minerals that people like to talk about. By the way, rare earths are a very specific type of element. It's this part of the periodic table. It doesn't include lithium. It's stuff like neodymium, selenium. It's the kind of minerals that you put into motors to make them work faster, into magnets to make them a little bit more powerful. It's not like earth-shattering stuff. But it does seem, take a step back, it seems like, obviously, the White House would like to be able to say it's getting something out of this, and this, to them, seems like the most attractive deal on the table. But I think it's also worth saying the Ukrainians have clearly mentioned it. They planted this seed in Donald Trump's mind back in September when Zelensky went and visited him in Trump Tower before the election and said, listen, we could do a deal and we've got all of this exciting stuff in the ground. Whether that stuff is really in the ground and whether they could actually make much money out of it, I think that's kind of like an interesting question that's unanswered at the moment, and we're going to find out more about it.
Very, very interesting question indeed. And of course, so we just want to remind everyone of the other big story of the morning, which is the boost to defence spending announced yesterday afternoon by the government. We spoke to the Defence Secretary earlier and got a response from Tom Tugendhat from the Conservatives on that.
That commitment to 2.5% by 2027 is ironclad. The important thing is that Keir Starmer said exactly how we will fund that, so people can have confidence in that. So this was a really difficult decision taken in circumstances that demand that we respond to this once-in-a-generation moment. But this is a time when hard power, not soft power, is needed to try and prevent and deter future conflicts.
Look, I think the Prime Minister's made the right decision. I welcome it very much. I think this has got to be seen as a step on the direction towards a higher defence spending, and this is the beginning. We are looking at a very different world. We're looking at a world where different commitments are now in question, and where it's absolutely clear that whether you believe that President Trump is fully committed to European defence or whether he's just challenging us, the answer is still clear, which is we need to rearm.
Maurice, it's interesting there, Conservatives ultimately backing the decision.
Yeah, I mean, Tom Tugendhat was very clear in the interview, wasn't he, that he didn't want to use it as an opportunity to try and, point score, mudsling, make it too partisan. He was very clear. He welcomed the announcement. He thought it was a good idea. He still wanted more. He was, not quite fully convinced by the numbers, as Sam's been pointing out earlier on the show, in terms of how exactly they're getting to these numbers. But nonetheless, I mean, clearly, when it comes to national security, we saw this before. When the Tories were in power, we saw Labour and Keir Starmer relatively supportive of the government, didn't tend to criticise too much, tended to go with what they were doing. They felt that actually politics was bigger than that. And to an extent, we're feeling something similar. I mean, Tom Tugendhat is not a shadow minister, and he has been lobbying not just Labour, but he's been talking about defence spending from his own government, his own party, for a long time as well. So it fits his brief.
A tricky one as well for the Conservatives, I guess, to criticise when their pledge was to go up to 2.5% a little bit slower, albeit things have changed. Sam, how does all of this sort of poll in terms of the politics of all of it?
I think the polling reflects the bigger reality, which is that this is an enormous shift. It is something that is bluntly popular, right? The public back by quite a long margin, more than 2-1, the idea that you should cut aid spending in order to spend more on defence, and that's what Keir Starmer has done. Interestingly, although overall slightly less popular amongst Labour voters, by a margin, Labour voters still support this. They're still more in favour of this than against this. I think there's been a falling out of love with the international aid system for some years, some decades even, from its high point at those Gleneagles summits with Blair and Brown. The case hasn't been made well for it. There's been lots of corruption scandals and waste and misuse scandals, and there haven't been people agitating for it. And interestingly, I include in that Keir Starmer, who could have resurrected the International Development Department set up by Gordon Brown that was folded into the Foreign Office by Boris Johnson, back into a separate department again, but he chose not to. Quite a lot of the aid spending still goes on asylum seekers, hotels and stuff, not the kind of thing that people traditionally associate with it. So it is a sort of, it is a move that is in tune with the British public. But it is something, there was something of a flavour of a relaunch about yesterday. You saw that slogan at the podium. Another relaunch. So for those of us with long memories, we can remember the 5 missions and the 6 milestones and the 3 foundations.
As confusing as they are.
And it was only in the 3 foundations, I think it was 3, not 4, anyway, somebody can check, that they mentioned defence spending at all, but it certainly wasn't within the first 13 priorities of this. But now it is, and that slogan on the podium that you can see over there on the screen behind you, "Secure at home, strong abroad," is now the sort of mantra, and that's a sort of blue Labour, the sort of conservative elements of the Labour Party coming to the fore. This is a different Keir Starmer from the Liberal lawyer and from the one that we saw who put growth first, and now we've got a different sort of construct of Keir Starmer, different people pouring different visions into a malleable political figure.
Simply, if you're right in saying that this polls well, that's a different, for the government who haven't had the best polling to date. Ed, how big a shift is this to announce such a spending change? It's interesting, obviously, the timing, clearly designed to come before the trip to Washington. It's also quite close to the spring statement, but they obviously wanted to make sure this could be done now rather than wait till then.
And there's this other kind of sword of Damocles hanging over the government when it comes to next month and the spring statement as to whether the Office of Budget Responsibility is going to say you're going to break your fiscal rules. So the entire kind of spending plans, leaving aside how much of it is going on defence, how much of it is going on health and so on, the entire spending plans have some big question marks over them. But I mean, it's as Sam's saying, it's this, to some extent, a response to the fact that the world is changing. The world is changing. Europe feels more alone than it has done for quite some time. America seems to be retrenching. Europe has been able to rely on the US to essentially subsidise a lot of its defence force for basically since the Second World War. And if that's changing, which it sounds like it is changing under Donald Trump, then everyone is going to have to spend more. And to be honest with you, 2.5%, 2.7%, or whatever it's going to be, those are kind of rounding errors compared with the amounts that you potentially have to see if Europe as a whole is going to have to defend itself in future. And it's not just the UK, it's other countries around Europe, and it's our industrial base as well. It's where do we get our energy from? What does this mean for net zero as well? So these are big imponderables, which I think we're only beginning to start discussing.
Mari and Sam, interested in your take on this. Mari, first, just could they have waited until the end of March and the spring statement and used this national security concern to more clearly break other manifesto pledges on tax and spend? I mean, have they now lost that potential cover to use that?
I suppose in a way, perhaps, but I think the fact that they would have been going to Donald Trump slightly empty-handed, that would not have been the best look when they are trying to demonstrate to the US very, very quickly and very, very urgently that they are listening, that they are on the same page, that they are, ideologically lined up on the things that matter. And so I think they would have lost that opportunity in this way. So it depends on how you want to do your political calculations.
Sam, quick take on that. And what's the timeline today for Keir Starmer? PMQ's obviously midday and straight away off to the airport.
Pretty much, you just said it. Look, I think the big question that hangs over is Keir Starmer has clearly acted because he's going to see Donald Trump tomorrow, right? But the question is, does it make a great deal of difference to Donald Trump? I wonder whether Keir Starmer's meeting with Trump isn't the most important meeting he has this week, or even the second most important meeting after Macron. But the most important thing that's happening this week is to circle back to where this discussion started, is that minerals deal. Is what we're actually seeing, the biggest help for Ukraine, actually going to come from the fact that President Zelensky will stand next to President Trump on Friday to do this deal, which is a curious one. It's no rare minerals for not much security guarantee, but the visual of the US president and the Ukrainian president standing next to each other, the actual most significant thing this week, and whether it's 2.5, 2.6 or 2.7, that isn't going to be really a big part of the debate.
Nonetheless, the press conference expected around 7 p.m. will be box office tomorrow when we get to Ed. Very quick final question. Presumably there's a greater economic domestic benefit from spending money on defence here than giving it to foreign aid? There's some kind of multiplier effect if we build things here?
Yeah, I mean, the UK, one thing we are actually still pretty good at is making, is defence. Basically making weapons, making the kinds of things that you can use to kill people. There's an enormous cosmos of different companies that have grown up around the UK, partly because of the US and that support, but partly because it's something that the UK traditionally has been good at. So you've got big defence companies which have done very well in the UK, and they could do well in the future. But as I say, we need to learn whether we're kind of reindustrialising, whether we're kind of turning the back on this deindustrialisation we've been doing for a long time, and it's not just spending a bit more money on defence that's going to change.
And many of those companies are actually American-owned because that's what America insists. So the picture isn't quite clear.
Well, guys, I love that discussion. We're out of time on it. I also feel a bit bad because you're all squished onto one small... I've got this whole massive desk. One of you should come over here next time. But anyway, Ed, Sam, Mari, pleasure as always. Thanks so much. Now, to a second Post Office IT scandal. Sky News has learnt that more than 20 cases are being investigated as possible miscarriages of justice over a system used by sub-postmasters in the 90s. Adele Robinson has spoken to the family of a woman convicted for stealing from the Post Office, whose case is now being re-investigated.
I think deep down we were ashamed.
A secret kept for 26 years.
I get very emotional about it because of what she went through.
One Pat Owen took to her grave.
Because of the post office, dying at 62 years old, heart failure, broken heart.
Her family speaking for the first time about Pat's 1998 conviction for stealing from the post office.
And then when she came home, she was a different woman. So we felt, we didn't talk about it. We didn't talk about it amongst ourselves, as a family. We didn't talk about it with the extended family. Our extended family don't know.
She was so confident, she knew she didn't do nothing wrong. And when the guilty verdict came out, she actually fell to her knees in the dock, crying her eyes out, shaking.
Sky News has learned the number of so-called capture convictions, like Pat's, now being investigated for miscarriages of justice, have more than doubled. all part of a post office scandal predating the infamous Horizon, which saw hundreds wrongfully convicted.
So this is all her paperwork.
But Pat's case is significant and could help turn the tide on convictions like hers.
That's the court documents, so everything's in there as well.
Like other sub-postmasters in the 90s, Pat used capture software we now know was likely to cause accounting errors. And in these documents, something new, evidence about the computer never heard before.
The problem on the computer is a faulty motherboard. This would have produced calculation errors and may have been responsible for discrepancies.
It's a description of malfunctions in the software from a computer expert who never turned up to Pat's court case in 1998.
The computer was sitting there on the week of the court case and was never used.
So I heard, now I can't remember who from, that he done work for the post office. If he turned up to be a witness in court for us, he wouldn't get any more work from the post office.
Despite best efforts, the expert's never been tracked down and the post office declined to comment. But victims' lawyer Neil Hudgell says any new evidence like this could possibly help other capture cases.
It's a real case of what if is Patricia Owen's case. You know, as their family, if you sat in their shoes and thinking about, well, if that expert had been able to give evidence, what could the outcome have been? How could life have been the last 30 years? So I say it's something that we've got a bit of a focus on particularly because, again, whilst it's relevant there, it may also be relevant in other cases.
These victims are the oldest in the post office scandal and it could be months or years before convictions are overturned.
I would give everything to have her back tomorrow.
And for her to see her name being called.
Yeah. Just to see that everyone knows that she didn't do what they said she did.
Speedy justice for this family, more important than ever.
Are you worried that this could take years?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll probably be dead. But I hope I'm not. I hope I'm still here to see her name cleared, you know?
Yeah, that's what we want.
Yeah.
Adele Robinson, Sky News.
We just wanted to bring you live pictures from Rishon-LeZion in central Israel, where Israelis have lined the streets for a public funeral procession for Shiri Bibas and her two young boys, Kfir and Ariel. The three were taken as hostages by Hamas and died while in captivity. Their bodies were handed back to Israel last week. There will be a funeral service. Eulogies are expected, including from other members of the Bibas family. These are live pictures with the funeral service to come. And if you do want to continue to watch that, you can do on the Sky News website or app. There'll be a QR code coming your way on the side of the screen in just a moment. But here, we're going to get you up to speed on all the day's other top stories now. Leah's got those for us.
Thank you, Wilfred. The Vatican says Pope Francis spent a peaceful night in hospital and is resting. Crowds gathered in St Peter's Square yesterday to pray for the 88-year-old who remains in a critical condition in hospital with pneumonia in both lungs. We do expect results from the Pontiff's CT scan to be released later today. Transport Secretary Heiley Alexander says she believes an increasing airport capacity. This is ahead of a deadline, isn't it, on the decision to expand Gatwick Airport's second runway. The airport, which is in West Sussex, plans to bring its emergency standby runway into regular use, which would allow an extra 100,000 flights a year by 2030. 4 men have been arrested after attempting to fly a drone filled with drugs and other illegal items into a prison. Police were called after the drone was spotted in the sky close to Manchester Prison. Officers found that prisoners had been burning holes into windows to receive the packages, often containing drugs, weapons and even takeaway meals. Onto the picture story of the day. A sinkhole has swallowed a car in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. As you can see, one vehicle is inside the cavity of the sinkhole and another perched ever so slightly on the edge. 30 properties were left without water after the road gave way yesterday afternoon. Luckily, nobody was injured. And then on to these extraordinary scenes. Chris Eubank Jr. slapping an egg into Conor Benn's face at the end of a fiery press conference between the pair. Their fight is on the 26th of April. Well, Eubank Jr., he's posted on X saying the reason he used eggs was because Conor Benn, who had failed 2 drugs tests previously, had blamed contamination. Meanwhile, the World Boxing Council say that a highly elevated consumption of eggs was a reasonable explanation to why he had failed those tests.
At least we now know why there was an egg use.
Yes, because vegetables, eggs, any kind of food at a boxing match is always quite a curious thing to happen.
Exactly, at a press conference especially. Right, let's move on now to what we have to do to reach net zero. Well, the government, climate advisors say there are 2 big things we have to do, and Tom is here to tell us exactly what they are.
That's right. So the headlines out this morning might have been about, you know, being told what you can and can't eat and whether you can fly on a holiday. Those are kind of much more minor concerns when it comes to what consumers need to do to be on the path to net zero. It's essentially just 2 things that get you 70% of the way, putting a heat pump in your home and getting an EV if you're in that position. Problem is, of course, they're 2 of the most difficult things to do and some of the most expensive, and that is the challenge for government, how they're going to get consumers to adopt these things willingly, because it isn't something I don't think people are going to be able to be forced to be done, and we just had a look into that in this report. Having the heat sucked out of your home, watched by a thermal imaging camera.
I don't think you'd appreciate how much of a draft there is from there. Wow.
Reveals the drafts and cold spots that, multiplied across tens of millions of properties, represent the next front line in tackling climate change. Maria's house in Bristol, like pretty much all the rest in Britain, will need a bit of work before they can ditch their gas boiler for a greener, more efficient heat pump and see it save money in the long run.
I think in terms of, you know, financing it, yeah, there'd need to be some kind of support, because it's, you know, I don't have, you know, spare capital to put into just sort of, you know, funding this outright.
The difference between the top and the bottom of the chart on here is...
It's why the latest report from the Committee on Climate Change is its most consequential yet. Few of us noticed the 50% cut in emissions achieved so far, made by ditching coal for wind and solar power. But cutting the remaining 50% falls largely in and around our homes. By the late 2030s, heat is important. Warming our homes with zero-carbon electricity is the single most important step to getting to net zero. But the electrifying pace will have to increase both in our homes and beyond. Roughly 1% of all UK homes have a heat pump fitted. By 2040, that figure needs to rise to 52%. Electric cars on the road must go from 2.8% now to 80% by 2040. And industry needs to decarbonise more too. Electricity currently meeting 26% of demand, that should grow to 61%. And all that demand will require 6 times more electricity from offshore wind. But, says the climate watchdog, it will have to get cheaper quickly. Consumers simply won't switch until it makes life better.
It's not asking you to be colder, not to drive, not to take your holiday. It's saying we expect business and government to work to make these better, modern technologies available to you. And also that means that we help the planet.
Their new advice shows how consumers and the wider economy will benefit from the rapid shift away from fossil fuels mandated by law. But it's a cash-strapped government that must work out how to afford the fixes needed to deliver it.
Yeah, I mean, great report there, Tom. Lots of people, though, will say, look, I'd love to have an EV, I'd love to have a heat pump, but it's really expensive. So how can we make that change?
Yeah. Well, effectively, we're not going to be able to do it. Right now, those cars are just too much more expensive than a second-hand diesel or petrol. For most people, it's just not a choice they can make. You've got concerns about charging infrastructure and things like that as well. When it comes to heat pumps, same thing. A new heat pump, about £13,000 compared to a gas boiler, £3,000 to £5,000. And you have to upgrade your heating system. So it's going to have to be something that the government takes charge of.
Subsidising, perhaps.
They have to subsidise a bit, definitely for low-income households and for social housing. But the rest of it's going to have to be the private sector. So they need to make these things investable. You know, how can a private company could, if the returns on a heat pump, if they were that much cheaper to run, a company might put that in for you for free and you pay back the cost of it on the savings you get on your energy bill. And the savings could be very big by the 2040s, 2050s. These things will be cheaper for consumers. It's how do we get over that initial hike, that investment cost up front? And it's something that government's going to find very difficult to do. They don't have spare cash. And right now, consumers don't either. So that's the trick. But I think we're looking, and certainly this report advises government, the private sector is going to have to be incentivised. And that means tweaking the market. Electricity has to get a lot cheaper as part of it. And there are levers they could pull to try and do that, but is it going to be enough?
Tom, great stuff. Thanks so much. Still coming on The Breakfast Show, after a short break, we will be discussing a little bit more about the AI impact on the creative industry.
Once almost lost, these denizens of the deep are back.
The problem for these whales is global warming. Water temperatures are rising.
We're worried that the animals are actually starting to starve.
Deadly and outdated. What do you think should happen to the nets?
I would like to see them go.
I'm Nicole Johnston, Sky's Asia correspondent, based here in Beijing.
A towering monument to the China dream and its demise.
From one end of this country to the other, China is littered with real estate that's falling apart.
China is facing a tsunami of the elderly.
We have to work as long as health allows, otherwise, no money.
China is under pressure to pay for the pensions of 500 million retirees. I've reported on a wide range of stories from around the world.
Mass protests forced the president to flee.
The sight of the president's private swimming pool only reinforces to Sri Lankans the great divide here between rich and poor.
Aid groups say Gaza is now the world's most dangerous place to be a child.
The Israeli army has raided towns and villages all over the West Bank.
These tunnels run all over Gaza. The Gaza Strip is ridden with them. A referendum designed to unite the country has only deepened its divide.
Sydney's floodplains underwater again.
This is the third or fourth time in 18 months that their homes have gone under.
Sky News, the full story first.
It may seem like a gimmicky toy, but it is part of the global race between the United States and China for new technology. This elite engineering, designed to humour and to help us.
Weeknights on Sky News.
This is your chance. Tell people. Welcome to the Politics Hub.
Our police force has apologised.
If you want to find out about Grimsby, you come to the docks.
I'm live in Jerusalem.
Are you not concerned that that could lead to all-out war?
Hello there, good evening. There are fears of an upsurge in violence. What's at stake here?
You are watching the press preview, a first look at the front pages as they arrive.
I saw police being forceful, pushing young men and women to the ground as they made almost 100 arrests. Will the cold affect your voters?
Well, we have a lot of tremendous support.
Free wherever you get your news.
The people here know that worse storms may well be on their way.
I'm Martha Kellner and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles.
Welcome back. Dozens of British artists have come together to protest against the government's proposals to copyright law in the UK, with many signing the letter to the Times newspaper. One of them is the award-winning screenwriter Simon Beaufoy, who joins us now, amongst other things, writer of Slumdog Millionaire and The Full Monty. Great to have you with us, Simon. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good morning.
Can you just clarify for our viewers, first of all, the state of play? I mean, is this something that you say is already being abused, that AI is teaching its models off your creations and breaking copyright law and you need the government to step in? Or is it slightly the other way around, that that's not happening yet, but they are potentially going to introduce rules and laws that might allow that?
Well, two things. Like most things on the internet, we are running down the road to try and catch the fast car that's already gone. The internet bots have scraped so much creative work already and are already using it. Just as an example, in a slightly facetious way, I thought, I've never been able to come up with the idea for a sequel for The Full Monty. So I put into Chat GTP yesterday, write me a film treatment for about a group of male strippers who set up a steelworks. I thought, there's a sequel. I pressed a button, and within 20 seconds, I had all the characters, I had a 3-act structure, I had a timeline, I had a sequel. So it's already there. They've already scraped everything to do with the script for The Full Monty and reproduced, shuffled the pack and reproduced kind of the opposite, but it's all done. There's a sequel written at the push of a button. So who is now going to employ me, pay me thousands of pounds, and go through months of screenwriting and script writing process when you can push a button and get a kind of knockoff? It's not great, but it wasn't bad. That's what was really terrifying to me, is it wasn't bad. And look, we're only at the beginning of these developments.
I mean, I guess
I've seen how fast the internet has improved.
I guess it's hard to argue against whether innovation, pure innovation, leads to things being, faster and quicker, and even if it's machines doing it, then I guess as innovators, we'd all have to respond and up our game. But it's a different question if they're breaking copyright law to get there. Is your suggestion that that has already happened?
Yes, it's clearly already happened. And the government's suggestion to try and bolt the stable door after the horse has gone, which is to get artists to opt out of AI using their material, is clearly unworkable. There's no way of regulating. We all know how well the internet regulates itself. I mean, how well has it taken child pornography off the internet? How well does somebody trying to get revenge porn photographs taken off the internet? They take it down, it comes back up again. There is no regulation. So to ask the artists to police the internet, which is effectively what an opt-out is unworkable. It's also deeply immoral. It's like saying, it's inviting a burglar into your house and saying, take anything unless I say, don't take that. If an opt-out says you must not, I as the artist tell you not to take that piece of work. But, the burglar will take something else. It'll go and take my car instead. It's sort of legalized theft. Intellectual property is called intellectual property for a reason. It's property. It's our work. It's the nuts and bolts of what we earn our money from. And if people are simply allowed to take that, unless we specifically say to that specific organization or that machine, do not, which of course it's not going to listen to, of course not, then our work is gone. It's been stolen. I mean, it is theft.
Simon, you've got your pen there in the hand, I can see. If you had a blank sheet of paper, love it. What would you be doing? What message would you give to the government about how they could help the future of the industry survive?
You have to protect the next generation of musicians, artists, filmmakers by an opt-in at the very worst. An opt-in is at least legally watertight. I have said, yes, you can use my material to train your AI bots. Then at least there's no legal contest about that. But honestly, all artists need to... There's something much more significant at work, which is quite hard to talk about at just past 9 in the morning, which is it's not just a financial crisis, it's an existential creative crisis. If AI is allowed to use all of our work and reproduce kind of knockoff, it's a big equivalent of a bazaar selling knockoff Rolexes and Gucci handbags. You're going to get the same things reproduced. AI can't innovate, it can't invent. It can copy, it can replicate, it can shuffle the pack very cleverly. But you will get nothing new. You won't get those moments in art that stop a human in the street. The first time you hear a Beethoven Lake Quartet, the first time you see a Van Gogh, the first time I heard a Radiohead track that made me stop in my track and go, what is that amazing thing? Mm-hmm. You won't get that anymore. You will get a million Radiohead knockoffs at the press of a button. But you won't get the next Radiohead. You won't get the next Billie Eilish. Why is she going to write her songs when 1 million copies can be reproduced that aren't as good, but okay? You know, everything is okay. That screenplay that was created at the push of a button in a few seconds, terrifyingly, it wasn't bad. It was okay, but it wasn't new. There's nothing new will happen. You are effectively putting a roadblock down and saying, no new invention, no innovation. There will be no more Picassos. That's it. You'll get Picasso knockoffs. You won't get the next generation.
Just very quickly.
Sorry, I'm very passionate about it because it's a really important argument, I think.
No, and just very quickly, because we're pretty much out of time. Obviously, this consultation period is over. Did you feel like the government was listening or not?
The government sent out a highly complex document that we were asked to fill in that was, if you were part of the technology industry, it would be easy to fill in. As an artist, it was very difficult to fill in. I hope they're listening. I hope they will roll back this idea of an opt-out, which is blatantly unworkable. Well, I just have to hope that they do, because if they don't, they will lose thousands, possibly millions of creative jobs, and worse, they will put a roadblock into what all human beings need in their lives, which is new creativity.
Simon, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So to come here on The Breakfast Show, how you can help fight climate change by making 2 changes to your households. We'll be discussing it next. Welcome back. Well, how can we reach net zero? The government's climate advisors say there are 2 big things we have to do. First, buy an electric car. Second, replace your gas boiler with a heat pump. Only when they pack up and not immediately. That's some of the advice to reach the targets that are ahead of us. Let's discuss all of this with Zachary Leather from the Resolution Foundation and Fatima Ibrahim, the co-director of Green New Deal Rising. Thank you very much to both of you for joining us. Fatima, I'll come to you in terms of the sort of state of play here, where the advice, increasingly it sounds like it's going to affect people at home, and it's going to be personal choices that they might not be wanting to take to reach these targets. Do you think that's going to be a challenge over the next 5 to 10 years?
I mean, first, just to say this report is hopeful and shows us that there's still pathways to tackling the climate crisis that also grow the economy, lower bills, create well-paid jobs across the economy. And just to remind everyone, the focus of this report is actually about what government action should be. Yes, it will change the way that we live, but the onus is on the government. How does the government mobilize the economy to bring down our carbon-intense ways of living and support people to make those changes by investing in free public transport so that we take public transport instead of driving, make food that's grown locally much more accessible so that people are eating less meat. And so, yes, we will have to make changes, but this isn't a report that is blaming the public. It's actually putting pressure on the government to make better choices available to them.
And Zachary, your reaction to the report, heading in the right direction, perhaps?
Completely, yeah, I agree with Fatima. This is a report that's saying that we're on track, that there is a path, and that there's a huge bonus on the table here for households. You have the CC saying that households are going to save over £1,000 on their household bills by 2050 if we do all these things. That doesn't mean that you're wrong. The next 10 years is going to be a big change for households. This is a new phase of the net zero transition where we turn to households as taking a centre stage. That doesn't mean that this is bad news for them. Drivers are going to be huge winners from this. CCC are saying for the first time that we're going to have cheaper cars as well as cheaper driving. That's going to be a big part of those savings. And yes, there are going to be costs as well, particularly in heat pumps. CCC have revised up their estimates of how much heat pumps are going to cost. That's going to be a challenge, and it's up to the government to make sure that the people are supported with those costs, and that the savings as well are ones that households feel.
Do you know what? It's really encouraging to hear an optimistic take on this, because it can often be very sort of doom-mongering and gloomy. And Fatima, just give us the headlines of the numbers in this report. I think I'm right in saying that we've already cut from 1990s as a starting point emissions by 50%.
Yeah.
And we need to get it down to 80% or so of cuts. But we've already done the first 50% of cuts.
We absolutely have, but as we know, as we make more cuts, they get more difficult, and it's going to require bolder action from this government. And it's a shame that this government, even today, is trailing the expansion of airports. It is not saying no to Rosebank oil field, which would be catastrophic for our climate targets, and it wouldn't grow our economy. And so I think this is a timely report, but we need to cut our emissions fast. 2030 is a key date that global emissions need to be cut by half. And so we aren't on track. The CCC has, year on year said that the government's commitments are not in line with the kind of targets that we have in place. We want Labour to be a step change. We've wasted 14 years under a Conservative government that was just dragging its feet. We can't see more of this from this government.
Have we not already cut ours by half?
The UK is responsible globally for the Industrial Revolution. We are still a huge emitter comparatively to other countries and our size. So we need to cut faster and quicker than other countries so that we can enable a global transition, especially when we see countries like the US lagging behind and pulling out of the Paris Agreement. This is a moment for global leadership.
Yeah, and I suppose that's the issue, isn't it? Fatima makes a good point there, Zachary. Globally, when you have perhaps the Trump administration, where you see big companies, rolling back on their personal climate targets, where does that leave people who then have to fork out for an EV that actually they can't afford, or heat pumps in the house that are hugely expensive?
The UK set its net zero target, and we need to reach that by 2050. Globally, that's kind of what we need to do in order to meet the Paris Agreement. These are international commitments. And the speed here, think of it in terms of what we need to do and how fast we need to go to meet that target in a smooth way. And I do kind of reject the framing that this is going to be a cost, for households. There are savings here as well. The CCC is saying that electric cars are going to be cheaper than petrol cars by 2028. That's
but there are so many
news.
Things that tie you up with, say, an EV vehicle, which I would love to get. But in order to get an EV vehicle, I have to have a charging point linked up to my house. And if I don't have that, then I can't buy it. And so I suppose the question is, for some people watching, make it easier for people to make those choices?
Absolutely agree. It's on the government to support people through these choices. The CCC is clear that there are going to be big benefits from that and that there are going to be huge savings that households see from the fact that they're going to get cheaper driving, cheaper cars, cheaper electricity. These are huge gains, and it's on the government to make sure that those gains go to as many households as possible and to make it easier for those households. Yeah.
What would be your reaction, Fatima, if we do, as expected, approve the expansion of Gatwick, which is using obviously an existing runway to do it? Better than Heathrow, or?
I think it's outrageous. There isn't an economic case in terms of the increase in flying that we've seen since the pandemic hasn't actually increased our GDP and our productivity. More people fly out of this country and spend money than those who come into our country. What we should be doing instead is increasing connectivity within the UK so that it doesn't cost £300 for someone to travel from Manchester to London. Those are the things that would grow our economy. Those are the things that would force people to spend money within our communities and grow our communities. So there isn't a climate case for it, and it would be a betrayal to future generations, and it doesn't grow our economy in the short term.
But if there is, there's clearly demand for more airport capacity. Is it better to do Gatwick than Heathrow?
Neither of them are good. And even in the CCC report, one of the recommendations is that we need a frequent flyer levy. So there's a whole host of recommendations in this report on how to reduce flying. And so even in this report, there isn't a legitimate case for the expansion of airports. While public transport is still incredibly expensive, particularly trains in this country, while people aren't able to sort of get around to nearby towns, why are we trying to increase airport expansion when it isn't growing our economy in any substantial way over the next 10 years or 15 years?
Well, we'll see what happens on that Gatwick expansion. I guess the comments from Heidi Alexander this morning suggest that it's going to be approved. It's expected a decision in the coming days. Guys, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks very much for joining us. Good to see you. Still to come here on The Breakfast Show, 4 in 5 NHS doctors have treated patients in hospital corridors or waiting rooms within the past month. We'll discuss that story next.
Once almost lost, these denizens of the deep are back. The problem for these whales is global warming. Water temperatures are rising.
We're worried that the animals are actually starting to starve.
Deadly and outdated. What do you think should happen to the nets?
I would like to see them go.
I'm Nicole Johnston, Sky's Asia correspondent, based here in Beijing. A towering monument to the China dream and its demise. From one end of this country to the other, China is littered with real estate that's falling apart. China is facing a tsunami of the elderly.
We have to work as long as health allows, otherwise, no money.
China is under pressure to pay for the pensions of 500 million retirees. I've reported on a wide range of stories from around the world. Mass protests forced the president to flee. The sight of the president's private swimming pool only reinforces to Sri Lankans the great divide here between rich and poor. Aid groups say Gaza is now the world's most dangerous place to be a child. The Israeli army has raided towns and villages all over the West Bank. These tunnels run all over Gaza. The Gaza Strip is ridden with them. A referendum designed to unite the country has only deepened its divide. Sydney's floodplains underwater again. This is the third or fourth time in the 18 months that their homes have gone under. Sky News, the full story first. It may seem like a gimmicky toy, but it is part of the global race between the United States and China for new technology. This elite engineering, designed to humour and to help us.
Mandatory evacuation, you must leave!
For many people, Harvey is far from over.
People here believe the water will be this deep for weeks.
I'm Greg Milam, and I'm Sky's chief North of England correspondent.
Are you trying to run me over, Sir Philip?
No, go away.
Look like it, sir. Will you respond to those who made accusations, Sir Philip?
Can you go away?
Sky News, the full story first.
You want to talk business? Meet me in the On-Board Lounge. Fly Emirates, fly better.
These are live pictures, as you can see, in Tel Aviv at the moment, and awaiting, of course, some of the funeral processions, details of the Bibas family that's taking place today in Israel. Crowds have gathered outside for that. Meanwhile, the bodies of the final 4 Israeli hostages will be released by Hamas this evening without a further ceremony, as was the case last week. Well, in return, Israel will hand over 600 Palestinian prisoners whose release had been delayed. Meanwhile, the family of released Israeli hostage Eli Sharabi has told Sky News he was tortured while in Hamas captivity. Our Middle East correspondent, Alistair Bunkle, has this report from Tel Aviv.
The image of Eli Sharabi being released from Gaza 2 weeks ago, looking gaunt and weak, shocked and angered Israel. His brother has told Sky News that Eddie was tortured by Hamas and barely saw daylight for 16 months.
Since day one, Eli was held in extremely difficult conditions, dozens of meters beneath the ground, and the treatment he received from his captors was very, very humiliating and very threatening. Eli was starved in an extreme way. He was humiliated, beaten. The most basic things a person needs for his health, to breathe clean air, to drink clean water and not dirty water. He didn't get any of that.
Eddie's British wife Leanne and daughters Noya and Yachal were murdered on October the 7th. As he was being released, Eddie said he was looking forward to being reunited with them. It was only when he reached Israel that he found out.
Only once he was in the safe arms of Israel, Eli received the news. He was told that our mother and our older sister were waiting for him there. And when he asked where are Leanne and the girls, when they told him that they hadn't survived October the 7th, it broke his heart. There was this great outburst of sadness.
Eli and Sharon's brother Yossi was also kidnapped on October the 7th, but he was killed, it's thought, by an Israeli airstrike, and his body is still in Gaza.
I think that everyone deserves, at the very least, for their people to bring them back for a proper resting place. If not on their feet and alive, then at least, if that person lost his life, he should be brought back with dignity. He needs to be given the proper respect, to be brought back to his soil, to his land. My commitment, just as I fought for Eli, I'll fight for Yossi and for all the hostages, until the very last one.
The first phase of the Gaza ceasefire is now almost complete, but there has been little negotiation on the next phase. With no agreement yet to extend the truce, the war could resume, possibly in the coming days, and with 63 hostages still being held in Gaza. Alistair Bunkle, Sky News, Tel Aviv.
Now, the country's leading medical minds are warning a lack of space in hospitals is having a direct impact on the safety of patients. Research by the Royal College of Physicians found that almost 4 in 5 NHS doctors treated patients in corridors or waiting rooms in the past month. Matthew's here to tell us more about the significance of this sort of survey-based data, but nonetheless painting a picture that I think a lot of people are kind of aware of.
Yeah, aware of, but I think we shouldn't lose the power of the shock of it, you know? I think it is expected, it is something we've heard about before, but nonetheless, here we have a survey about 1,000 doctors from the Royal College of Physicians, and 4 in 5 of them saying that they're treating patients in, you mentioned waiting rooms, corridors, but also places like toilets. It's a small percentage, but 5% of doctors said that they were treating patients in the only spaces available, and they were places like toilets. It was about 40-something% of people said that they were being treated in corridors, as you can see on screen there. And look, this has been warned about by the Royal College of Nurses. In fact, just last month, there was a controversy, you might remember, just at the end of last year when a London hospital advertised for a nurse to actually provide corridor care. So this is well known about, but it doesn't make it any less shocking. And actually, one of the most striking statistics in this survey, I thought, was that 60% of doctors who responded thought that by treating patients in these sorts of areas, they had compromised patient safety. And that is the most important thing. We've spoken to Dr. John Dean, who's the clinical vice president of the Royal College of Physicians. Here's what he had to say.
This is distressing for doctors, nurses, all other health professionals trying to deliver the best care they can, but in an environment that's not enable them to do that. But what's important about this is that we have clarity about it. We've got action. We know how big the problem is. We're calling on the NHS to publish data on this and publish it consistently on a month-by-month basis, because this isn't just a winter problem. This is an all-year-round problem, and we have to work together to eliminate this unsafe care.
Yeah, Matthew, great to shine a light on this with the data, but it doesn't change the pressures that doctors and nurses are facing.
No, not at all. And the data's an interesting one because actually last year the NHS England at least said that it would start to collect this data from January, but it's not published it yet. And that's one of the things that the Royal College of Nurses and the Royal College of Physicians want to see, is they want to see this data so that we can be upfront about the problems that they're facing. And I suppose the more we talk about it, as you said at the beginning, you know, the more that we can take steps to address the problem. We have a very brief statement from the Department of Health, if you'll permit me. They said that it's shocking that corridor care has become a feature of our NHS. Despite the best efforts of staff, patients are receiving unacceptable standards of treatment. This government, they say, has taken decisive action over the past 6 months to ease pressure on the NHS.
Matthew, great stuff. Thanks so much for that. We are out of time here on The Breakfast Show. It's time now for Sky News Today with Gareth Barlow, with all the build-up to Prime Minister's questions at midday.